As people get older, it is very important that people remain active and maintain that muscle strength.
Yeah.
So let's talk about for somebody that is tuning in right now and they haven't been aware of this, they haven't been building that baseline in adolescence or even midlife.
Yeah.
What can they do later on in the game to be most protective as they continue to age?
Yeah. It's never too old to get strong. I feel like it's never too young to be strong, and you're never too old to be strong. And that would be, I think that there's multiple ways to push an adaptation. And that could be through blood flow restriction. Obviously, check with your physician. It could be through the stim suits if you don't know how to contract skeletal muscle. It could be machines. It could be kettlebells. It could be bands to start with. But you do have to incorporate resistance, so strength, not necessarily hypertrophy at the older ages, really focus on strength. I focus less on hypertrophy because hypertrophy is something that you have to always maintain, but strength is critical. So you focus on strength. And, if you're older, it is also about pushing yourself. You don't get to be off the hook, right? You don't get to be mentally off the hook and not push yourself, which I think I see all the time is, oh, well, I'm older. I don't want to get hurt. There are ways that you can train without a significant cost of doing business. And I think that becomes critical to understand. It's never too late, but working with a fitness professional is important.
And for somebody that is older and they're just getting started, they don't want to over push it in the beginning while they're building up, or they have certain time constraints and they can only do, a certain amount of workouts or work out for a certain period of time. Are there certain muscle groups that are more important as we age that we want to focus in on?
Let me interject something here. People say they don't have time. And the reality is, if you don't have time for fitness, then how do you think you're going to have time for sickness? How are you going to have time for that? You don't have time for fitness, then you're going to make time for some kind of illness. And that's the reality. So essentially, someone doesn't not have time to do that. If you think you're busy now, can you imagine what it really looks like? So I do think that that's really important to clarify that it's a non-negotiable and you have to make time. That's the reality of it. So there's that. And I forgot the second part that you said.
Well, just certain muscle groups they would want to work out to get more.
Yes.
Or even functionally, as they're getting older, they want to have certain
leg strength
movements available to them as they age. So where would they want to focus their energy?
Leg strength is key. Leg strength is key. And you want to make sure that you can also respond to any kind of, quote, ballistic movement if you fall. So that means being able to step off a box or being able to catch yourself if you fall, being able to respond to some kind of physical insult. So leg strength, carries, again, as you're older, kettlebell carries are great. Squatting, assuming that you can do squats well, I would, consider a front squat with a kettlebell, can help improve a hack squat where you have a lot of contact, these kinds of things. So overall leg strength is really critical. That'd be the first thing. And then, being able to carry and lift things overhead. So as an individual ages, I'm much less likely to recommend single bodybuilding type movements and much more likely to introduce or have them work with their trainer to do more functional type movements.
We talked a lot about diet and protein and the importance of protein. We even got into protein powders, but we didn't get into supplements. I'd like to talk about, in a general sense, supplements that you recommend and take. And then for people specifically when it comes to muscle building, what they might want to include on top of that.
Yeah. So if you are looking for muscle health, I typically recommend creatine. I recommend fish oil, omega-3 fish oil. I recommend vitamin D. And I'm really big into urolithin A these days. Urolithin A is, it's almost like a prebiotic. It's made, 40% of people cannot make it, and it helps with mitochondria health. It helps with mitochondria turnover, density. It's really good for endurance, those types of things. And I like it because there's some good scientific evidence out of out of Europe that I think is very valuable so far, and the US. But those are the things that I'm really, really into right now.
Can people get that from food, that latter one?
Urolithin A, some people, which is why I recommend supplementing, not everybody. So for example, urolithin A is a compound that might be found in pomegranates. You may or may not be a metabolizer of it. So a way to get it and ensure so you don't actually create the urolithin A would be supplementation. Right now, I've been using MitoPure, amazing company, amazing people, amazing product. So this is like, it's very rare I get excited about something, but I've been very excited about that. So urolithin A and again, vitamin D, fish oil, creatine. And if someone is interested in whey protein powder, I use First Forms. They have a natural whey. I tend not to use a bunch of different flavors, those kinds of things.
And how do you feel about collagen? How that relates to, we've talked again about whey protein, you just mentioned it, but.
Yeah, so collagen has a protein score of 0, meaning it's an incomplete protein. I think collagen is great for hair, skin, nails, and even gut health, but it is an incomplete protein and it does not count towards protein, dietary protein. Doesn't mean that it's useless, but it is not helpful as a complete protein or for a protein essentially for muscle.
Let's talk more about creatine. You mentioned that one first. And when I think of that supplement, I think back to, being a teen and certain people that take that when they're trying to get that hypertrophy that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
But I'm hearing about it more and more in the health and wellness space lately. So talk about the many different benefits of that and who might want to consider taking it. Is it everybody or just somebody that wants to put on more bulk?
Yeah, I think that creatine can be beneficial for individuals who eat a low red meat diet. And it's about 5 grams a day, men and women, maybe men can go a little bit higher. The benefits, and I don't actually, I should look into this, but I don't know the mechanism of action of brain health for creatine, but for aging and brain health, creatine across the board is supposed to be very helpful as somewhat of a neuroprotective effect, which is interesting. And who should take it? I do believe someone who's older, definitely. And again, a vegan or vegetarian, I definitely recommend those individuals take it. I also recommend individuals that are on a lower protein diet also benefit from taking it. Yeah, and it's been around for a very long time. Again, the longer something's been around, the more an individual should have trust in it, because by that time, things that have been, it's been exposed. If it's been around for 60 years at this point, massive adverse effects are going to be known. And I think the major issue would be GI effects.
You mentioned how you're mulling over the idea of later, closing that eating window later in the day and eating more focused in the, first half of the day, I guess, all the way to an earlier dinner. But take us through what a typical day looks like now. When are you working out? When are you eating? And what are you eating?
So I'm super bored with my workouts right now. So typically I just finished my book. So the whole goal was to maintain muscle mass and try to get stronger. So I'd been doing 3 days a week of heavy leg training, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and then throwing in a longer cardio session and some kind of high intensity interval sprint in there. And I'm just bored to tears. So basically I have now added in a CrossFit 1 to 2 days a week, and changing up my resistance programs to more dynamic movements as opposed to the heavier squats and like leg type stuff. So adding in some more jumping and faster turnaround. But I'm looking for a competition. So if any of your listener knows of a good competition, maybe it's like kettlebell or CrossFit, something. I'm looking for something new.
All right. Talk about the diet piece. When are you eating? Yeah. What are you eating?
Well, I haven't eaten yet today, and that's pretty late for me. But typically, that's not true. So I had a bowl of cottage cheese. I'll have a robust amount of protein. And then I think I used Nancy's. There's some prebiotics, some fermentation in there. I think that's really valuable. So I had some cottage cheese, and I'll have a steak for dinner or a steak at that next meal. I'll probably have some fruit, steak, and maybe some kale. I'll have... typically, again, today was a really busy, not normal day, but I'll have 3 meals today. And that will be some kind of red meat, some kind of vegetable, fruit, maybe some yogurt later.
And as a female, how do you approach eating and working out differently than a male, if you do
I
at all?
I don't. I think that one of the things that happens is, say perhaps I don't eat as much as my husband, but I don't. I think that when we introduce more barriers or more friction, like do we need to train with our cycles and do we need to do all these other things? I think that creates a barrier to entry and a barrier to consistency. So oftentimes it doesn't have an impact for me. And I would say unless someone is really an elite level athlete, unless of course they just really can't train, that less barriers to entry is better. Less complication is better.
Well, one barrier I'm sure happens both for male and females is they may resist getting into at least heavy resistance training because they don't want to put on bulk. So let's bury that myth and talk about, why they don't need to worry about that and they can get in the gym and really push it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's just like, I just can't believe that that's still not something that hasn't, I can't believe people still believe that. It takes a lot to put on mass. It takes a lot of time and attention, and you're definitely going to put on, mass, if possible, probably half the speed of a male. So women, I've never seen a woman come to me and say she's getting too bulky.
What about men?
No, never. I've just never seen it happen. I mean, listen, I've only been practicing since 2006. So maybe somewhere along that line, it's going to happen. But that's how many years in practice is that? It's a long time in practice.
So we've talked about the sleep piece. We've gone deep into nutrition and protein. Yeah. We've talked about exercise, resistance training, supplements. What other pillars have we not addressed that's important for somebody, health in general, or specifically to resistance training?
Yeah, I think the biggest pillar that hasn't been addressed is the mental piece. And the human condition, if that isn't addressed, nothing else matters. So the people listening to your podcast probably have listened to it for years and heard lots of really good advice. And the question will be, how much is being implemented? And whether it's the listener, whether it's myself, whether it's anybody else, the reality is the human condition doesn't like for unfamiliarity. So what does that mean? That means all of these concepts we're talking about are great. If you are not aware of your own human weakness and you are not aware of your own human condition, specifically is knowing where you fail and where you're unlikely to start. So for example, someone might listen to this and have 5 million reasons why they're not going to implement it. And it's really not because they're not going to implement it, it's because it's unfamiliar. And so the brain will try to create an excuse or a reason as to why you don't need to do that. And it's not personal, it's just the brain doing what it's doing, keeping safe. And people have to appreciate the role that cognitive error plays in a willingness to get better and to get healthier. So number one is really understanding your human weakness and the narrative that you're telling yourself. And if you can outsmart that, then you'll be able to execute. And then I would say that the biggest hurdle that I see, the second biggest hurdle, is understanding that there's a self-worth health threshold. And this is people will only get as healthy as their own self-worth. What does that mean? That means that, again, I've been seeing patients since 2006, and those that feel worthy of health will continue on a plan. Those that don't feel worthy of health will subtly sabotage themselves. So they'll get so healthy, like they'll lose a certain amount of weight, and then they'll feel great. And that feeling great is a very uncomfortable feeling, and they will do whatever they can to then push themselves back into a domain of where they feel comfortable. And that's really critical also to understand, and then move that upper limit threshold forward. Because again, it's only a unconscious implication that can easily be adjusted as long as it's brought out into the open.
If you're enjoying this episode, let me know by tapping like and subscribe below. Thank you so much, and now back to the chat. So for those two pieces, you've talked about the awareness, but is there any other advice you can give to break through for people who are feeling the resistance mentally and they need that extra nudge,
Yeah.
what would you say to them?
Yeah. So I would say, like, appreciate that the brain is doing what it's doing, and that you can have the resistance, but it's either going to own you or you're going to own it. Right? You got to go through it, and you might as well just do it. Yeah, be stronger than your own resistance. You have to be stronger than your own resistance, period. And everybody can do that. Everybody can do that.
And I always talk about how maybe listening to an interview like this is a moment of inspiration, that if you're feeling that, act on it. Get that inertia started. Because, day-to-day life, it's busy for all of us and we can get stuck in our patterns. But if this interview is acting like a pattern interrupt and creating that space for you to create a new habit, use that, form the momentum, and then hopefully you can sustain that as a habit over time.
Yeah, totally. And then understand that, you might hear this and be inspired and realize that there are going to be periods of times where you're totally uninspired and you can't wait for inspiration. Doesn't matter. That's just not the way that it goes. You just have to execute. And ultimately, the more you execute, the easier it gets. And again, you should expect it and anticipate the fact that you're probably going to tell yourself 1,000,001 reasons why not. And again, as long as you know that that's coming, then you decide.
I know your husband's a SEAL, and it sounds like some of that mentality from a SEAL has trickled over in.
No, I was like this before. No. I was like this before. It's probably why we connected as much as we, have and do. And also, a lot of my patients are military operators or entrepreneurs. And, people always talk about setting goals and like, this is the goal. And I would say we don't set goals. We set standards for behaviors, standards for who you want to be. And I think that that's very critical. And again, goals come and go, but a standard of being and a standard of way in which you execute doesn't.
Gabrielle, I know part of your story, you've had this really interesting journey as part of I think it might have been part of your training as a doctor, or after, you can clarify that.
Yeah.
But you've gotten to work with a lot of elderly people on their deathbed. And where I want to take this, we're making a big pivot here at the end, but I think this ties back to the inspiration piece, where you've had this unique look, talking to these people and seeing what life is like at the end, where we can all, I'm sure all of us have taken time to think about that and process that, but I'm sure it's different when you're actually in that part of your life.
Terrible.
So talk about what that was like for you on the other end, plus what you're able to take from those experiences and still apply into your own mentality in your own life that you can inspire us with.
Yeah, I think that it was probably the most difficult time. I wasn't prepared for that. I wasn't prepared for, so I did my fellowship at WashU in St. Louis, and I did my fellowship because I was wanting to study obesity medicine and nutrition. And that's why I went there. And part of the deal was, in order for me to go there, part of my funding would be that I would have clinical responsibilities to become a geriatric fellow. I didn't want that. That wasn't what my choice was, but it was presented to me that in order to do X, I had to do Y. So I was very into this health and wellness. And then all of a sudden, I was dropped into a category of patients that I had never serviced before. I mean, you do when you work in the hospital, but you're not seeing 30 patients a day while you're on a palliative care unit, all of whom are dying, right? For a period of months. Like, not going to geriatric homes where like these people are living in just horrible conditions and working at nursing homes in these severely demented units. Like, I did not know what I was getting into. And I would say the biggest thing, well, number one, it's like bone crushing, right? It's like bone crushing, life crushing, soul crushing, so depressing. Because again, the amount of exposure to death, I think, is above and beyond. So oftentimes we are exposed to one person in our family, right? Like you have one elderly parent or two elderly parents. You're not seeing 30 patients a day for 2 years, right? Of different people. So the amount of volume that you're seeing of like death and depression from families and what the impact is, I was not prepared for. And I would say arguably that's why I'm so vocal and so vocal in the space, because I've been there. And, everyone can be in their ivory tower, or you can be like a optimization expert or all these other things, or you can look at mechanisms in the lab. And until you're like sitting there and you're like watching these people, watch them with their families take their last breath, and they're talking about the regrets that they've had in their life. I mean, like it's intense. It is intense. So what did I learn? I learned, number one, you don't have room for error. You don't have room to hear all this nonsense in the space. You don't have that kind of time. That window of youth and change closes rapidly. And to be confused and to miss potentially what will move the needle for quality of life forward because of all the noise in the space is it's a mistake. It's a mistake. So yeah. So the biggest things that I learned is, there's not time for all this nonsense that goes around. It's not time to cut out protein. There's not time to, forego exercise. And all this stuff is not right. Like it's not right. And then the other thing is don't have regrets. Do the things that you want to do.
You've touched on that regret piece a couple times there. One, how it affected you, but also, working with these people at the end of life, their regrets. There's this common post that I've seen a number of times on the internet of top regrets of people dying. From your experience, what are some of the top things people were regretting? So hopefully we can use that and work back and use that to facilitate how we're spending our time and energy.
Yeah. I mean, I would say there was like two big things. It was number one, people felt like they wished they had had better relationships. It was about the relationships with their family and their friends. And then the other, and it was a lot about kids, right? Like, and the other thing was, like there's this one woman, she died of heart disease, and she was like, I'm ready. And I just wish that that my family would be as ready as me, So I don't know, it's not really regret, but I think that preparing, that understanding that it's really fragile and really short,
And correct me if I'm wrong, you talked about how having that experience was a lever for you to get your message out there publicly.
Well, yeah. So I see all these people arguing in the middle, right? Like, do you think I really want to talk about protein anymore?
Probably not, but
I've been talking about this for 8 years.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, like, do I do. But do you think that a part of me is like, I don't want to talk about the environmental argument. I mean, the environmental argument, like all this vegan vegetarianism, like at some point it's all ridiculous. It's ridiculous in the way that people don't have the wisdom to understand that this narrative, it doesn't affect, like, who is it affecting, right? Does it affect the 20-year-old, I don't know, in LA or, in a coast? Maybe, but they can recover. The problem is when these blanket statements of reduced dietary protein come out, the unintended consequences to the older population, it's devastating. The unintended consequences of the silly influencer post, they're devastating consequences. And that's why I do what I do. Is I do what I do because if you have a capacity to protect people, you have an obligation to do it. I have an obligation to do it. Can you imagine? I couldn't live with myself if I just sat there and I knew that, environmental veganism is a smokescreen for big companies where we're all fighting amongst ourselves or doing whatever they want. I couldn't live with myself. So I do it because I want to fight for the people in the middle that are confused. You know, I'm a well-trained professional from an extremely reputable institution, trained by one of the world-leading protein experts. If I don't say it and I don't counterbalance the quote longevity experts, then I think that we're going to have devastating consequences. I think that there are going to be devastating consequences. I think that we're going to see a rise in osteoporosis like we've never seen before with these younger women. I feel like these older individuals that are hearing this restrict dietary protein, I think we're going to see an exponential increase in falls and sarcopenia. It's not the right thing to do. So do I want to talk about protein? I mean, the truth is I love the topic, but would I be spending the time after Thanksgiving, which most people are not working, to do this, to get the message out there? I think that if it was a more balanced conversation, I'd probably take the day off.
Well, Gabrielle, I'm glad you didn't, because this was a very powerful conversation. We covered a lot, hopefully a lot, and I feel like we did that you haven't talked about on other shows. And yeah, no, just a very powerful conversation. Again, coming back to the piece where you don't necessarily want to talk about it, but I think this is important.
I'm joking.
No. This is something I think you touched on quickly and said you didn't want to talk about the vegan piece. Yeah. But I have you for a few more minutes, and I think this is a good place to close, because there may be, and I'm guessing there probably is, a group of people that are tuning in right now that are avoiding animal protein. And we've already stressed the importance of animal protein and the difference of the quality between that and plant protein. So for somebody who is holding on to that veganism because of, say, the environmental or the ethics, and obviously the ethics is something you can't really say a lot about, but let's talk about the environmental piece, because people might be using that as a reason not to eat these quality proteins. So talk about why that isn't something they should hold on to.
So the ethical piece, I completely can understand. So I was like almost vegan for a very long time. And it was for an ethical piece, right? But I ultimately got really sick. My hair fell out, like my dentition was terrible. And I couldn't sustain it. And I remember the first time I ate chicken, I was like, it was in my 20s after I had been really close to vegan for couple years, like 3 years, I was like crying. It was very emotional. So from an ethical standpoint, I don't anticipate anyone needs to change, right? Like I would never ask someone to change their ethics. From an environmental standpoint, if you are not eating meat because you believe it is bad for the environment, you have been grossly misinformed. You are not going to eat your way out of climate change. Nobody is. The climate change issues that are happening are population-based. They're transportation, electricity, and industry. Perhaps the better question is, why the big smoke screens? This is not a food conversation, right? You would have to go vegan for 2 years to make up for one transatlantic flight. Okay, so the environmental piece for veganism, vegetarianism is not where the attention should be. If we really care about the planet, don't waste food. Carpool, limit your flights, turn off your electricity. There's many other ways to impact it than further destroying people's health, right? And it just doesn't make sense. And you can look at some of these climate change experts like Frank Mitloehner at UC Davis. There's, it's a smokescreen. The climate change conversation for nutrition is a smokescreen. And I just really hope that, there's this crazy thing that happens when we become biased. We end up having very circular arguments and circular reasoning. And if someone presents evidence of something different and an individual continues to circle back because of their belief, you have to question, why are you so tied to this? Why is one person so tied to this? So I suggest people be very open-minded and question, where is this information coming from and why do they think that to be true? Just because something is repeated doesn't mean it's true.
Since we last talked, your mentor has been on the show, Dr. Don Layman, who
Oh,
you
good.
have your new book dedicated to.
I know. Isn't that the sweetest?
That
I
is.
just love him
Yeah,
so
he's
much.
incredible. And we got deep into this, but I think it's definitely worth repeating and getting your perspective on. And that's
Mhm.
where we were in the conversation before we jumped in and talked about this calorie deficit piece. So where I want to go is,
So if you ask him and I see sometimes a little bit different. If you were to ask him, he would say calorie deficit is definitely super important.
okay, well, let's move into the breakfast. I think you guys are pretty similar in this realm.
Oh, yeah.
You guys both recommend, I believe it's between 30 and 50 grams of
Yeah.
protein as a
Mhm.
bolus, as part of the
Mhm.
breakfast to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And leucine is part of that. That's part of the reason why we need to get to that threshold. But before we get into the nuances, talk about what muscle protein synthesis is. It's a very scientific sounding term. Are we just talking about
It's
building
actually
muscle?
pretty complex. No, it's
Okay,
actually
let's
not.
have you hash that out.
It's actually pretty complex. Don and I are going to do an entire podcast on this in the next few weeks. That is how complex the idea of thinking about this is. Muscle protein synthesis is what we use to measure the incorporation of amino acids into tissue, and this is believed to be over time. It is what you would think of as a biomarker. It is a physiological process that we can measure. It does not necessarily mean that muscle protein synthesis will generate from the amino acid alone the building of new muscle. I mean, we assume it will over time. We assume over time there's muscle accretion. But that again also takes a stimulus. It also takes a physiological adaptation through training. But the muscle protein synthetic response is a response of the tissue. And again, it's this incorporation into these amino acids into the tissue. But it doesn't, and it's necessary to prevent sarcopenia. Again, in my opinion, it's necessary to preserve and protect skeletal muscle. But does it mean that it will build skeletal muscle alone? No, and that's not why individuals necessarily look at muscle protein synthetic response. But is it necessary for that response to happen for the health of tissue? Yes.
All right, I think we still
It's
need to
very,
hash this out a little bit more because I'm
it's
still,
actually pretty complicated.
yeah,
It's
because
pretty
I'm picturing
complicated.
amino acids coming in and we're talking about building of tissue using those. So right away, my mind goes to building muscle. But you're saying that is part of building muscle, but not
Yeah, but
necessarily happening every time when we have muscle protein synthesis.
not at all.
Okay.
So the 24-hour muscle protein synthetic response is probably the bigger picture. How much of a response did you get? Again, I think there's a lot of nuance, which is why we're going to do a whole show on this with Don. But one thing is for certain is we do need that response for the health of skeletal tissue. You do need that response. And we do know that response translates over to protecting lean tissue. Another thing to note is that to the degree of the response, you can't always measure it, right? So I think in order to really measure a change in tissue, it might have to be greater than 15%. We use it. It's a generally accepted biomarker. Does it directly translate to muscle mass? No, it doesn't.
Got it. But there is some kind of building. It's an anabolic process.
It is an anabolic process. And that's a very good question.
Okay. So let's get into the nuances. Somebody has that bolus of protein. Whenever their first meal is, they can intermittent fast or not. Say it's 10 a.m., just again, giving an example here. And they have 40 grams, and we should be specific here, of animal protein, because there is a difference between animal and plant, and we can get into that in a little bit. Talk about what happens in the muscle. We'll call it MPS because it's a long term there. Talk about MPS when we take in that
Mhm.
bolus and what's happening physiology-wise?
Yeah, well, the skeletal muscle is a nutrient sensing organ, and that is part of what it does. It senses the quality of the diet, and it is exquisitely sensitive to leucine, one of the branch chain amino acids. When there is a sufficient amount of leucine, then it stimulates mTOR, which is mechanistic target of rapamycin, which then is a precursor for a lot of very it's a protein complex, and there is a very large complex cascade that happens and ultimately results in a muscle protein synthesis. There's a few other things I think are important to point out. This muscle protein synthetic response could last for a few hours, maybe it lasts for two, but the other initiation factors like EIF4 and the other factors, again, if you were to look at this in a diagram, there is just a very complex system. Once you stimulate a mechanistic target of rapamycin, again, there are other initiation factors that have also been activated. And that is why the first meal is so important because number one, it's really been studied and we know that it has value. We've seen that, there was this, I think it was Arnell, some of the earlier protein distribution papers looked at something called, it was in women called and protein pulsing. And what they did is they did they looked at somewhat of the distribution. They looked at 2 small meals of protein. So it was an average of 70 grams of protein in a day. They looked at 2 small meals and then 150 gram bolus meal. And they saw a greater retention in lean tissue over time. But yeah, so all of that is to say that this first meal is very important. And to my knowledge, there's no data regarding the physiological, the biochemical effect on that second meal. So are these initiation factors still elevated at that second meal? Maybe, again, I think it's important that we don't necessarily know, but then that's where the 24-hour protein ingestion comes into play because that's also very important. But that first meal has been very well studied. In fact, all the data that I've seen.
You mentioned there being a bunch of different initiation factors, and we know the leucine threshold and getting that bolus of protein is part of this. But if we're having that 30 to 50 grams of protein, does that cover all the initiation factors?
Yeah, it does. It's really based on that stimulation of mTOR through leucine.
And when it comes to 30 to 50 grams, is it just about the leucine?
So I'm going to answer that question in 2 ways. It is about the leucine because as skeletal muscle changes over time, the physiology of the muscle changes. It is thought to become more insulin resistant over time. Again, I was just arguing with Don about this because I don't necessarily believe it does just naturally become more insulin resistant. And I'll tell you what he said. So I said, Don, it's not that it just becomes more insulin resistant. And he said, no, there are clear changes in skeletal muscle because an 80-year-old, even if they've lifted their whole life, they're not going to be as big as they were when they were in their 30s. And I was like, okay, so maybe there is this physiological process that happens. But anyway, so I digress. So skeletal muscle is thought to become more insulin resistant over time. It is thought to also become more anabolically resistant, meaning the efficiency to utilize dietary protein, specifically the efficiency to utilize leucine, becomes somewhat blunted.
Is that as we age or as we put on muscle mass?
Allegedly. No, it's allegedly as we age. Could also be with obesity, anything that challenges the integrity of the muscle. So anything that challenges the integrity of the muscle can affect the processes of that tissue, the efficiency. I think that's a better way to put it, the efficiency of that tissue. The 30 to 50 grams comes from that leucine threshold. If you're eating high quality protein, you're getting a minimum of 2.5 grams of leucine, which is necessary to stimulate that process of mTOR, mechanistic target of rapamycin. if you do not hit a threshold, you won't stimulate it. It is kind of I'm talking about it as an on and off switch, but there's low levels of mTOR activation that are going on all the time. But just from a muscle perspective, because there's mTOR in every cell in the body, but from a muscle perspective, this stimulation requires a particular amount of protein. When you're younger, you could get away with 1.8 grams of leucine. So when you're really young, I have 2 really little kids, 2 and 4, they don't need a protein distribution. They don't need a bolus of protein because they're growing. They're driven by hormones. They're in a growth phase. They don't require an anabolic stimulus from dietary protein. I think a better way of saying that is they don't require a leucine threshold, right? They could easily get away with 5 grams of dietary protein because, again, they're always growing, up until a certain age. I would say if I were to pick a number at around 30, when hormones potentially are changing, or maybe it's 32, or maybe it's 35, the efficiency of that muscle goes down. And in order to have muscle respond like younger muscle, so in order to have older muscle respond like younger muscle, you have to increase the dosing of that protein. And that's where potentially going up to the 40 to 50 gram really kind of maxes out the system. Yeah. And there's some really early work. I would say another hallmark study would be Katsanos did some of these earlier studies where he looked at, or his group looked at younger individuals in their 20s and then older individuals 65, and found that the younger individuals will get a full robust response with 1.8 grams. And that when an older individual was given a 2.5, maybe it was 2.5, 2.8 grams of leucine, that older tissue responded like younger tissue.
All right. There's some nuance here I want to make sure we clarify before we move forward. So as a young child, we don't have to worry about the protein bolus. But when we get to about 30, that's when the 30 to 50 grams comes into play. And then if we take it beyond that, somebody around Don's age, I think he's in his mid-70s, it sounds like in that bracket, or somebody who's obese might need to even up that even more. Is that correct?
Well, it's safe to say that as we age, we need more protein. That is safe to say. Is there any evidence to suggest going above 1.6 grams per gram per kilogram of body weight? Not necessarily. You're not necessarily going to get a more of a muscle sparing effect. Again, there's a lot of things to consider. Perhaps if you're in a calorie deficit, yes, but if you're eating a normal diet that is not at maintenance, not in a calorie deficit at 1.6 grams per kg, do you need to go above? Above that? Is there evidence to support that double that number would be more beneficial? I would say no. And I would say that the aging literature would say anywhere between 1.4, maybe 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kg.
All right, let's take a hypothetical situation here. Somebody
I love those.
decided to, they understand what we just said, but they're trying to hack it.
Okay.
And we get a leucine supplement. And then we mix that with, say, a green smoothie in the morning. How would the body react to that?
I don't think that that's a great solution, because when you think about amino acids, they all have their own ratios. And a branched chain amino acid ratio would be a 2 to 1 to 1 ratio of leucine, isoleucine, and valine. If you just give leucine, the mechanisms, you would deplete the others. It exists within a system. So you wouldn't, from that perspective, want to supplement a single amino acid. And also, if your goal is protecting skeletal muscle, or potentially even putting it on, you need all the amino acids, essential and non-essential.
What about carbs and fat with that 30 to 50 grams? Do they matter though? What if it's just protein by itself? Are those components in MPS?
Insulin can be a driver of muscle protein synthesis as well. Is it going to be as robust as some of the others? Not necessarily.
Like, would it be a limiting factor is what I'm getting at. If it was just protein and not carbohydrates and fat, for MPS?
For muscle protein synthesis for the response, I would say that carbohydrates would not be a limiting factor. No.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm getting at. Or fat.
Yeah.
So it's just
No.
protein. It's not like you have to have that protein within a certain ratio of other macronutrients for it to take place.
No. And when you think about muscle protein synthesis, the muscle protein synthetic response, it can be driven by increase in total calories or insulin, driven by leucine, driven by resistance training, driven by growth factors. But the primary driver in skeletal muscle of the mechanism that we're talking about is leucine. It would not be, carbohydrates would not be a limiting factor.
So you just mentioned quickly there the fact that exercise stimulates it as well. Say somebody was to do a fasted workout in the morning and they really pushed it with resistance training in the gym, haven't had any protein, no leucine going in. What happens with MPS?
I mean, that's another way to stimulate it. The muscle protein synthetic response is stimulated by resistance training.
But would it really go anywhere if there was no amino acids coming in through the diet to keep it going?
You would not build muscle if you did not have dietary protein. What is also important to recognize is there's a synergistic effect between resistance training and dietary protein. And we have seen that in nearly every study. And there are some amazing studies that, for example, if an individual was eating close to a food guide pyramid, right? So you take two different groups. And this was out of some of the earlier work in Lehman's lab when they had started to really think about these things and understand that protein dosing mattered. And just the macronutrient distribution mattered. If you took two groups and you took one and you put them on the RDA for dietary protein, which is 0.8 grams per kilogram, and then kind of a food guide pyramid picture, 50-some% carbohydrates, and you still put them in a hypocaloric diet. So you put them in a hypocaloric diet and you compared it with the same total calories. So let's say it's 1,600 calories with a double the RDA dietary protein, 1.6 grams per kg. And what they found just at rest is those individuals who just cut calories lost, 35% of lean mass. Like the loss was 35% of lean mass. If you compared it to that individual group that had double the RDA, which is 1.6 grams, again, these are still isocaloric, with 2 days of very light resistance training, they lost roughly, it was something like 10%. So there is a synergistic effect between resistance training and dietary protein for the protection of skeletal muscle.
Let's talk about it from an energy perspective. And we've touched on this, but to get into the nuance there, if somebody hits that threshold, you mentioned before MPS being something that is energy intensive. So if somebody is making sure that they have that first meal, getting that bolus of 30 to 50 grams, how does that change the way those calories are metabolized in the body?
This is a very important point. So do you read research a lot? Where do you come up with these questions?
Just reading your book, talking to you and Dawn, and I'm just really into it.
This is an awesome question. This is a really, really intelligent and nuanced question. In the literature, you will see that the influence of this thermic effect of feeding is variable for dietary protein. Sometimes you might see it 10%, sometimes you might see it upwards of 20%, right? There's variation. And the question is, well, if it's just a macronutrient and you're feeding just this thing, which nobody eats just this one thing, why is it varying so much, right? Why is there a variation if you were to take 100 grams of dietary protein and you think that the thermic effect of food of that would be 20%, so you're actually only getting a net caloric intake of 80 calories, right? Because this process is so expensive. But in the literature, it's a variation of the percentage. Could it be 15%? Could it be 10%? Sometimes it's 20%. And the question becomes, well, why is it so variable? And I believe, and I could speak for Don because we've talked about this ad nauseum together, this is what we do, is that it's the amount of protein per meal that actually influences this thermogenic, it influences this thermogenic response, but the response is due to the machinery of muscle protein synthesis. Another way of saying that is, let's say you took a protein diet, and instead of eating it in a appropriately nutrient distributed way, like we talked about, 30 to 50 grams, you decided to do 10 grams throughout the whole day, right? You're 10 grams here, 10 grams there, 10 grams there. I suspect you would see a change in thermogenesis, that you would actually be utilizing less energy.
Because you're not activating MPS.
Exactly.
Okay. And then the whole other wing of this is the fact that protein is more satiating.
It's more satiating. It's much more difficult to store. It also, we talk about protein, but protein is actually 20 different amino acids, all with unique biological roles. And each amino acid has at least 2 different roles in the body. You think about threonine for mucin production. You think about tryptophan for serotonin, leucine for mTOR, arginine for nitric oxide. So it's not just, we talk about it in a generic term, but it's essential for a multitude of reasons.
And I want to highlight what we just got into. This is something I wanted to make sure we dove into. Up until this point, other than leucine, which we've talked about for the MPS threshold, we've been talking about protein as a whole in general. And yeah, when we're talking about 30 to 50 grams as that initial bolus, there can be such a diverse array of amino acids within that, because that's a good amount of protein. So if somebody's getting that from quinoa versus having a steak, it's going to be a totally different amino acid profile, even if they're having enough calories of quinoa to get the same amount bolus of protein in grams. So, and again, why I'm bringing this up, I want to highlight what you just said there. The fact that for whatever reason, when we talk about protein, we tend to umbrella it under protein as this term. And I know this is one of your core things you like to get into, the fact that we need to break it down because there's a lot more nuance in there.
Yeah, and I think that that's where the future of protein research is going to go, is that each amino acid is thought of as an individual nutrient. And that is where, once we begin to understand that, we will see that these foods are not interchangeable, and that high quality proteins are really, really important. And when you eat high quality proteins and you target skeletal muscle health, everything else falls into place. Right? So these essential amino acids like leucine, lysine, methionine, they're all not equally essential, right? And to say that in a different way, we have a day requirement for leucine, and that would be somewhat of a meal requirement. Whereas lysine, that is really important for carnitine synthesis, that might have a much slower pool turnover, right? Like that pool of lysine turns over much slower. This becomes very impractical for the individual to think about it. It just becomes very complex. Like, am I eating enough lysine? Is this enough methionine? Did I get enough threonine for my mucin production? Because 75% of threonine is utilized for mucin production. Very difficult. But if you understand the complexities of these amino acids, then the lay person will say, okay, I need to hit a high quality amino acid or a high quality food because I recognize that the amino acid profile in plant sources are different than the amino acid profile in animal sources. And it's just not about the total protein number. And that, I believe, is going to be the future, where we are looking at methionine, we are looking at lysine, we are looking at leucine, because those 3 seem to be the most limiting. And that's, I propose that that's probably where we're going to go at some point.
Well, the way I see it as you're explaining this, 1.0 would be getting to that 30 to 50 grams within that bolus.
Mhm.
And then 2.0 for somebody who's been there and wants to take it even further would be to make sure that's a certain quality of protein providing the array of amino acids. So for that person who's at that level and they want to make sure they're doing that correctly, you mentioned plant versus animal. Is it just getting your protein through an animal source? Is that going to provide enough of an array?
Yeah, it will. And again, you read the book. I'm not anti-plant. I'm not anti-animal. I'm a physician by training with years of nutritional science experience and training. And the perspective is we have to understand that foods are not interchangeable. And probably the best of both worlds, a diet would include both plants and animal proteins. And it's also, I want to highlight another layer to what we're speaking about. It's not just about the protein. It's not just about the amino acids. It's also about the things that ride along within the food matrix. For example, carnitine, taurine, creatine, all of which are in high amounts in animal-based foods. And, plants have phytonutrients and other vitamins and minerals. But again, we have to think about food as a food matrix. And if you are to eliminate one entire food group, this becomes a major challenge. For example, carnitine. I did this calculation, and I can't speak to the bioavailability of this, but carnitine is important for, many things within the body. It's important, for aging, just a whole bunch of things. And it's primarily found in animal foods. And could you find it in some plant food? And I saw that I looked at this calculation, and you would have to eat 8 to 11 avocados to equal one serving to get the needed amount of carnitine in a day. Is the carnitine deficiency in the immediate going to pose a problem? Probably not. But over a lifetime of pretty significant restriction might create an issue.
Okay. Given what you just said, and there's this great graphic in the book where you show a piece of meat and it has all the different nutrients. I think there's about 8 of them around it that are only found in meat, or at least significantly. But what I'm getting at here is for the person, for whatever reason, we don't have to get into the nuances of this, whether it be religion or ethics or whatever it is, they're not going to include meat in the diet. How would you guide them, given what we've talked about so far when it comes to protein and amino acids and these other nutrients? Have you seen a way to be complete, even if it does require a little bit more nuance to how everything's laid out?
Well, a person could be, you mean to be plant-based and be able to get their needs met?
Yeah, there's 2 different layers, though. The piece of meat, again, in your book with the 8 different nutrients that are, and you talked about the avocados.
Can you get that from plants?
Can we get enough of those nutrients plus enough of the right amino acids to get MPS stimulated on a plant-based diet? Have you found any nuance to helping people? Because no matter what we say, there's going to be a group of people, and it's become very significant within the health and wellness space, that aren't going to adopt animal-based protein for whatever reason.
Right.
So how do we help them optimize their health, or at least do the best they can given what they're going to eat?
Yeah, and that would be, you can definitely get enough protein on a plant-based diet, for sure. Would you, keep in mind that the RDA and the discussions of increasing dietary protein are not based on plant-based proteins. So it is based on high-quality proteins. So the RDA at 0.8 grams as a minimum to prevent deficiencies. That's probably not the same for a plant-based individual. It's probably higher for the minimum to prevent deficiencies. So yes, an easy way to do it would be to add shakes. A rice pea blend, soy or tempeh, any of those other things. You definitely could get enough protein. I would also recommend supplementing with creatine, and definitely iron, calcium.
Okay. But there is still a number of nutrients in the book, again, around that piece of meat that people that are vegan aren't getting. So is there anything they can do other than look those up and supplement with them?
I think that they would probably have to supplement.
And the other piece to this too, Dawn and I got into it, the fact that when it comes to plant-based protein, and I'm not putting words in his mouth, and I want you to clarify this. Is it true that we're not absorbing exactly what the label says when it comes to plant-based? We actually need
Yeah.
more of it?
Yeah. So these are issues with how they do protein scoring, like this DIAS and PDCAS, which is it's not super relevant for the listener. But the protein in the back of the label, with plant proteins, it could be, the labels are a bit misleading. It could be nitrogen, could be urea. It's not exactly the same as it would be from an animal-based source. It's typically lower.
And you mentioned when it comes to the plant-based diet, I think you said pea protein, but let's come back to animal-based and say it's a whey protein. And coming back to our common theme here of getting that 30 to 50 grams, how do you feel about using a protein whey powder in the morning with something that's a little bit less in protein to get to that number versus somebody that's just having like a piece of steak? Like, how does, obviously the steak's going to be more satiating, but from an MPS standpoint, having protein powder with a meal that's a little bit less in protein to still hit that threshold,
I think it's
versus
a great
steak,
idea.
how does that compare?
Whey protein actually can get away with less because the leucine content is so high. It's a great question, and a lot of the times we use shakes around here. We use whey protein shakes. In fact, don't tell my son who's 2, that's what he gets in the evenings instead of milk, because we're trying to cut back on his milk, right? Because it can bind to iron. But a shake has, so a whey protein shake in particular has the highest percentage of leucine. And again, that's really what you're going for. For example, in 1 scoop of whey protein, you might get, 1.8 to almost 2 grams of leucine in 18 grams of dietary protein. So that's great.
And how do you feel about, obviously there's going to be a totally different amino acid profile, but using a whey protein versus some of the other plant-based proteins, whether it be a rice protein, you mentioned pea protein, you have all these, and say you have all these in your pantry, how do you look at one versus the other?
That's a good question. I don't know if I've thought about it so much, but if I were to pick one, my first one would be a rice, what would it be? Maybe a rice pea blend. I'm not excited about pea protein alone. There's other compounds in there, whether it's, I think that there's a lot of compounds that we don't know. Again, it's almost, think about it this way, the metabolomics. So there's metabolomics, there's intermediate nutrients that we don't, I think, necessarily know what they do in high concentrations, because pea protein isolate doesn't exist in nature. It's whereas whey protein, could whey be the top of, cheese or wherever you get it. It's still something that we've developed and been able to use over time, and we know that it has immunoglobulins in it, like alpha-lactalbumin and lactoferrin. If I were to pick, I would probably do something like a rice blend. Again, pea it doesn't have estrogen in it, but it has other molecules, estrogen-like potentially molecules that have some kind of activity. I just don't think we know over time, if someone is just consuming a high amount of pea protein, what that's going to be like.
And how do you compare a protein powder that's a whole food, whether it be plant or animal, versus a branched chain amino acid supplement?
Branched chain amino acid supplements only have the branched chains, and that would be like starting a car without putting gas in the car.
Okay, so you're not a fan of those at all?
If you are eating a lower protein meal, if you're a vegetarian and you're eating a lower protein meal, you could use either a branched chain or an essential amino acid mix.
But it sounds like the hierarchy would be like having a steak, having whey protein, maybe some of the plant-based proteins underneath, and then the branched chain amino acids at the bottom?
Yes.
Let's
I like
let's
it.
move on.
I like the way you're thinking.
Let's move on to
Yeah.
some of the other meals. We've went deep into this breakfast piece and the protein bolus.
There's also something else I want to say about breakfast is, if you're going to be designing, and I'm not anti-carbohydrate, right? People, I eat a lot of carbs myself, actually, quite frankly. That the first meal and pretty much every meal outside of exercise, I don't really recommend above 40, maybe 50 grams of dietary carbohydrates because of the glucose disposal. And I talk about that in the book. You do want to keep insulin in check.
And the other piece to this too, I'll add, as you say that, and we've talked about this, but we haven't nailed on the specific, that protein, looking at it like, a dietitian may, where it's a certain percentage of the diet, you don't do it that way. You look at it again,
No.
body weight in pounds to grams. And if we're taking in less calories, coming back to cutting back calories like we talked about earlier, you still have the same amount of protein and you just lower the fat and the carbohydrates to lower those calories.
Exactly. So protein, dietary protein is the most important macronutrient. It is essential. It is literally what we are made of. Carbohydrates we don't need. We can make it. Fat, what the essential fatty acid need is so little. But dietary protein is irreplaceable. We need to keep up with daily protein turnover, which is anywhere from 250 upwards of 300 some grams of protein that we are turning over every day. From enzymes to body parts to everything and anything that you could think of. If we don't, eat enough, you're never going to eat enough dietary protein to offset that typically. But again, this becomes the pinnacle. This is necessary. Dietary protein is necessary to support over time these processes.
Say somebody tuning in right now is hearing about the importance of protein and this is new to them and they're excited and they're going to go take out their bag of whey protein and start supplementing with a diet that's already high in protein. What I'm getting at here is there
good.
too much?
This is a good one,
Say
yeah.
we do get that up to like 200 grams a day or 300.
Yeah.
How does the body respond?
So we've never seen evidence that something would indicate that we have a diet too high in protein. There was some initial thoughts that maybe because of the disposal of urea, the breakdown of urea and ammonia and et cetera, would be kind of this upper threshold, but we haven't seen it. I haven't seen that in the literature. We have not seen what a very high protein diet over time will do. And I've seen some data, Jose Antonio's published papers, again, they're short-term papers, 8 weeks or so, of 3.5 grams per kg of protein per body weight. Yeah, we don't see really any negative benefits or any negative effects.
And what about symptom-wise? Somebody that's been having a low protein diet, they come across your book now or your information or work with you, and then they really up the protein to the level we're talking about here. Do they typically notice a difference in how they feel after a day or a few days? And if so, okay, they do. So what is that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things about, at least from my clinical experience, is that when you get protein right and you increase high quality proteins, you begin to balance blood sugar because you're not dependent on, a whole bunch of carbohydrates and fats. You seem to just have a steady level of energy, and you're able to regulate blood sugar over time. And of course, there's this increase in satiation, and you begin to just, I don't know if it's be more sturdy. That's like such a abstract way of thinking about it, but you're getting a lot of nutrients. So whether someone is iron deficient or zinc deficient, it's again not just about the dietary protein, but when you support and build a diet around protein, there's a lot of metabolic benefits. Because again, while we're eating for protein, there are other metabolic outcomes.
Let's move into the other meals now, starting with dinner, because the way I understood it from your book is that the most important is breakfast, again, hitting on that threshold.
Mm-hmm.
But then second in line, we'll call it, is dinner and making sure we're getting a bolus at that time too. So talk about why that's important.
It's important in the context of if you really got the first meal right, because the large steak dinner has been around forever. And so most individuals will eat lower protein in the first meal, the second meal, and then have a large steak dinner. That is not what we're talking about. This is assuming that you've nailed protein in the first meal, that the next meal after going into an overnight fast is really important. Because number one, you're going into an overnight fast, and this is your opportunity to now protect skeletal muscle as you sleep. And so having that in a robust amount is very reasonable.
Last time we talked, you said you were going through a period of time where you're reevaluating intermittent fasting.
Yeah.
How do you think about that now, and what are you doing?
I now recommend everybody eat earlier. So before I used to tell people to push their meals back. I don't recommend that. I think there is something to this circadian biology and beginning your meals earlier and ending them earlier.
Okay. How do you feel about, obviously, as we're narrowing that eating window, we're going to have a longer period of time where insulin's going to remain low. So for somebody right now who's coming to this not metabolically healthy, can fasting, at least in the short term, as they're gaining their metabolic health back and having that more narrow eating window, can you see value in that case?
Yeah, I mean, intermittent fasting is a potential strategy for calorie restriction. I do think that, again, restricting calories, and also if they have any kind of GI issues, there is a positive to doing intermittent fasting. But if you're going to do it, don't push the feeding window back. Push it forward. Eat within an hour to 2 hours upon waking.
Okay, let's get into this a little bit more, because this is an area that Don and I actually disagreed on within our conversation. I was saying that there would be benefit to keeping insulin down for longer, having that tighter eating window. And again, I don't want to butcher his words, but I believe the way he was saying it, it was just a calorie thing. And it sounds like you might be in Don's camp, but for me, there's more to it with the insulin piece, and having that period of time, say it's 6 hours where you're not eating, or 6 hours where you're eating, your insulin's going to be at bay for longer. And I can at least see, for somebody who isn't metabolically healthy, which in our current society, there's so many people that are in that boat, how as they're gaining their metabolic health back, that could be just so powerful during that phase and potentially beyond.
Yeah. I think that, I do believe that calories are really important. And in terms of the insulin restriction of the intermittent fasting versus feeding, is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, the insulin piece. Like if somebody's insulin resistant and their blood glucose has just been awry and they've been eating within, basically the whole time they're up, and not negating anything we've talked about to this point, but adding in the fact that the eating window is tight and we're keeping insulin at bay for longer in the morning or at night, I see that being as beneficial. Don didn't see that. He didn't see it the same way as me. I'm just curious how you feel.
I would say that it's probably somewhere where both parties are right. So kind of what I'm hearing you say is there's the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity is what I'm hearing you say.
Exactly what I'm getting at.
Yeah. There's the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity that's like the insulin is driving obesity versus is it the calorie? It's probably a combination of both. So it's probably a combination of both. The calories matter, and then the insulin matters.
Gabrielle, in the health and wellness space these days, there's a ton of focus on losing weight. And for good reason. We have a problem in society these days with a lot of people being overweight or obese. But for you take a different approach to this and pivot a little bit and say instead of focusing on the weight loss, we should be focusing on putting on muscle. So why is that?
Well, when I think about where we are in society right now, I think about this obesity conversation that is just so pervasive. And everybody talks about the obesity epidemic and that we should be losing weight. And the reality is we're not over fat. right? This an epidemic is something that kills people slowly or kills people swiftly, and we're not seeing that. Obesity, I think, is symptomology of a much bigger problem, which is low muscle mass, impaired muscle. I think that we have a muscle crisis, not an obesity crisis. And if you take the perspective of muscle and muscle as this organ of longevity and really this as the pinnacle of health and wellness, then you actually are much more empowered. We've been trying to fix the obesity epidemic for decades, and we are fatter, more unhealthy than ever before. And, and I always think, like, if we have the correct problem, then we should be able to get a solution. So perhaps the correct problem isn't the fat problem, something else.
So what I'm hearing you say, for people tuning in saying, wait, I do have a weight problem, I'm tuning in to figure this out and get healthy. Yeah. You're just saying it's a bit of a nuance to that. We're going to get to the root rather than look at, the extra weight, which is a symptom. Totally. And to get to that root, we're going to talk about building muscle.
Yeah. And, above and beyond even building muscle is really understanding that muscle is an endocrine system. It's an organ system in and of itself. And muscle is so much more than just this fitness aspect that we think about it. Muscle is really critical for interfacing with the immune system. It's critical for nutrient partitioning, meaning the food that we eat. It's a critical component to insulin resistance. It's so essential when we think about the issues that ride alongside of obesity. So we think about obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, cancer, right? When we think about the metabolic input, and I simply mean by metabolic input, I simply mean the, elevations in insulin, glucose, triglycerides, and this low level of inflammation that exists, fat and the diseases that ride along with it are really symptoms of the challenge with muscle. And so that's how I think about it.
And when it comes to the fat loss piece specifically, is a big reason that putting on muscle is a piece of that puzzle is because it enhances the metabolic rate?
The reason that it's so critical to put on muscle and to maintain healthy muscle, there's a couple reasons why this is so critical. Well, number one, when you think about skeletal muscle and what it does, skeletal muscle is the primary site for glucose disposal. The domains of muscle exist, number one, in locomotion, which is really important as it relates to not falling or being able to be strong, being able to maintain your activities of daily living, going to the grocery, putting your suitcase in an overhead bin, those kinds of things, the physicalness of even just being able to walk. So there's a physical aspect of muscle. Then there is a metabolic aspect of muscle. And the metabolic aspect of muscle, the way that I think about it is, number one, it's the primary site for glucose disposal. Glucose disposal, carbohydrate metabolism, fatty acid oxidation, that all takes place in a large part in skeletal muscle. As we think about skeletal muscle, which is simply the muscle that we have under voluntary control, right? So we have cardiac muscle, we have smooth muscle, which are typically the organs, and then we have skeletal muscle, which is under voluntary control. This muscle makes up roughly 40% of our body. Skeletal muscle is that primary site for glucose disposal, which is really the carbohydrate metabolism. And again, what I had also mentioned is a primary site for fatty acid oxidation. Skeletal muscle is one of the first stops and also the largest. And it's curious to me that when we talk about obesity and fat and all this other stuff, it's just like the fat appears out of nowhere. Well, it doesn't really. You have impaired muscle tissue first, or at least as one of the first key challenges within the human body.
Well, you've done a great job of convincing us that this is important. We need to put on muscle. When it comes to doing that in a healthy way, how much is enough? Because somebody might be tuning in saying, I don't want to get all big and muscular and look like a bodybuilder type figure, but how much is enough to gain these health benefits that we're talking about?
I think that this is a great question, and a question that everybody asks me: how much is too much? Now, I think that we have to take a step back and we have to think about how we look at skeletal muscle. How do we measure it? Skeletal muscle traditionally has not been measured in medical practices. It's typically just looked at as body fat percentage, right? Or BMI. And that is a huge mistake as it relates to being able to identify the importance of skeletal muscle. When we think about the tools in which that's really been utilized for skeletal muscle, the next thing that we think about is a DEXA. And that is a kind of X-ray. It's a way in which you can look at bone density, also lean mass, which encompasses blood and all the organs other than fat mass. And is that helpful? It is helpful because we can actually extrapolate a lot. But again, it's not looking at skeletal muscle directly. And I want to say this again. So a DEXA doesn't typically look at skeletal muscle directly. It identifies fat and identifies bone, and skeletal muscle is lumped in with all the lean mass. Okay. So number one, there are challenges which relate to the measurement of skeletal muscle as it exists. So again, in medicine, it's very difficult to change and appreciate what we're not measuring well routinely. So that's something to consider. And I'll just mention, for completeness sake, the other ways that are perhaps much more accurate in looking at skeletal muscle. That would be a CT and a DEXA, or a CT and an MRI, which obviously people are not really doing. Okay, so how the original question is, how much is enough? And I would say, well, that really is a multifaceted question. Number one, we probably, unless we are a professional bodybuilder, all need more muscle. Okay, but more muscle alone isn't sufficient. It has to be healthy muscle. How do we get healthy muscle? We train it. We train it for strength. We train it for hypertrophy, which people say, well, that doesn't necessarily make you healthier. But actually, the goal is strength hypertrophy for a final indication or a final outcome of creating flux within muscle. Okay, so the listener's like, well, what the heck is flux? And we've all seen a marbled steak. Every single one of us has seen a picture of a marbled steak. And oftentimes, this is a good visual representation of what a sedentary, unhealthy muscle could potentially look like. And this is really the substrates in that tissue just remain static. There's no exercise to actually create utilization of these substrates. And I say this cautiously, but this is, that's not how it always looks. And athletes have different fat composition. But a good way for the listener to visualize unhealthy muscle is to really think about fat infiltrated into the tissue. And that fat infiltration is really an indication of a decrease in flux, a decrease in glycogen, an increase in fatty acid metabolites. And this really weakens muscle over time. It weakens its capacity to burn fuel efficiently. And ultimately, it potentially can lead to sarcopenia, which is issues with mass and function. And again, it's like a disease state of muscle.
This is really important. I'm glad you brought the quality piece into it. Yeah. And I've heard you talk about before, obese people actually have quite a bit of muscle because there's always that stress of carrying that extra weight. And this comes back to the quality factor where they might have more muscle than a lean person who might work out a little bit, but that quality is subpar.
Exactly. And then, by the time you are overweight or obese, you have impairments in skeletal muscle. And I think that, and maybe not everybody, but I would say the chances are if you have excess body fat, you have challenges within your skeletal muscle already, and then I think, okay, there's the strong man. But again, is that a marker of strength? You can be strong, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're healthy. So, I'll tread lightly there, but if you are overweight or obese, then skeletal muscle is oftentimes there's a blunted response. So your ability to put on skeletal muscle or have the same kind of robust response as a lean person, it it's different, right? And that's really just this process of muscle protein synthesis. It's potentially that there's a blunted response, and that tissue, that obese tissue, looks and works a lot like a older individual's tissue, like an aged tissue. And this was by, I think, Nick Bird did this out of, actually, he's at University of Illinois right now. This really was some the research really originated from him. He started looking at obese tissue and seeing that there was this blunted metabolic response with muscle protein synthesis. Now, that's not to say that if you are younger and obese that you can't course correct. Absolutely. I'll say that the older an individual gets, the more difficult it becomes because there's a lot of things that play into that, like a decrease in hormones and an ability to push to the same amount of exertion that one typically does.
Coming back to our original question there, how much is enough? You mentioned the different scans. Is there a certain scan you recommend for people to get a baseline?
Yeah.
I don't feel like we have a clear answer there. What is it
No, I do have one for you. I do have one.
No, let's get to what that looks like. Somebody who isn't obese, they're maybe working out a little bit.
Yeah.
And they're just looking to make sure they're getting that dose to get the different health benefits from that muscle.
Yeah. Now, I don't like looking at muscle alone because you do have to look at strength measures, and you do also have to look at metabolic markers like triglycerides, insulin, and glucose. One way that a person can kind of extrapolate this data is getting a DEXA, body composition DEXA, and putting it into formulas for appendicular skeletal mass index, which is simply max divided by meters squared. And there's certain ranges like, and people can put that in. These numbers are kind of arbitrary and aren't going to be helpful for the listener right now, but there's a certain cutoff that would indicate sarcopenia, and then there's a certain cutoff for athletes. And actually, I have some unpublished data that I'll be putting in my book, actually, that comes out in September, that actually puts together what I would consider a non-athlete ideal range. But again, it's extrapolated. It's not looking at a muscle under MRI or CT, but that's not feasible for people. So again, it's looking at a body composition DEXA and then putting it into a formulation, which anyone can do, in an appendicular skeletal mass index.
For the average person who's somewhat aware and wants to stay healthy and keep, a lean body,
yeah,
likely the best that they're going to have done to measure things is look at a BMI. And most conventional doctors, that may be as far as they go as well. So I want to talk about BMI and how that isn't necessarily a good marker. And we need to probably go a bit deeper to really see what's going on in the body.
Yeah. And I would say, so body mass indexes was traditionally used, I think it was for insurance purposes. And basically, it's an outdated measurement. They still consider it valuable, but really body mass index. And it's like if you are a certain body mass index and it doesn't actually look at the difference between fat and skeletal muscle, it's like this weight measurement. I would say that I think that we're evolving past that. I mean, they're still utilizing it. I think what is much more relevant is body fat percentage. And that can be done a number of ways. There are now scales like impedance scales and looking at a body fat percentage. And typically the current recommendation is like, anything 25% or more is considered overweight or obese. And that's for a man. And then for a woman, it would be 30%. And, I think that these numbers are a bit too high. You do need a certain amount of body fat. But a good way to think about it, perhaps maybe, and again, this is just my personal opinion, is what were you in high school? What was your body fat percentage in high school? And typically, this is the time that you were the most anabolic and you're typically leaner, right? And I think that we've all seen it, that you had a certain kind of growth trajectory and understanding where you were at that place. But that being said, body fat, you could easily say, as long as a woman is still menstruating, maybe that's 15%. Maybe that would be her ideal to shoot for. Maybe it's 18%. And for men typically are lower.
Early in our conversation, you mentioned the fact that muscle is this endocrine organ, which before preparing for this interview and diving into your work, I hadn't heard somebody talk about it that way. So I want to talk about this aspect of muscle and the myokines and how that all works.
So cool. Yeah. This was actually pioneered by a woman named Dr. I think her first name is, it's like Bente Pedersen. And she is in Copenhagen, and she is a physician. She studies exercise immunology. And her work was really, and still is very pivotal, and we don't hear about it so much in the US, but basically it looked at skeletal muscle as this endocrine organ, and there was this exercise factor. When you contract skeletal muscle, and the majority of the research is done in cardiovascular activity, that skeletal muscle secretes these myokines. Myokines are proteins much like cytokines, right? So the inflammatory cytokines that, say, are released from macrophages. And what's so interesting is they have a pleiotropic effect, meaning when they're released from skeletal muscle, they act differently in the body. They actually counterbalance inflammation in the body. So it increases this interleukin 6, which we always talk about as being inflammatory, like the cytokine storm, but actually exercising muscle can increase over 100-fold more of these myokines, which there's hundreds of different myokines, but let's say interleukin 6 or interleukin 10. And it's this exercise factor that affects the immune system. So, essentially lowering systemic inflammation, balancing other inflammatory cytokines like TNF alpha, also relates to nutrient partitioning. And why is this important, and what is nutrient partitioning? Nutrient partitioning is the way in which we utilize our macronutrients, the way in which we utilize carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And oftentimes when we think about exercise, we just think about calorie utilization. But there's another interesting component to exercise, that there's an interplay between this interleukin 6 and these myokines that are released from muscle that, say, make liver more sensitive or make adipose tissue more sensitive. So essentially what I'm saying is there's an exercise factor above and beyond calories in, calories out. Like it's a very complex interplay, a crosstalk between liver, adipose tissue, and skeletal muscle that really originates from this exercising muscle. And that is, the definition of an endocrine organ. It has both local and systemic effects. And it's just very fascinating. So this is one way in which skeletal muscle is an endocrine organ.
So when it comes to this endocrine piece, how long does that effect last after somebody does a workout? And is it something we want to be triggered all the time? Do we want to hit that on a regular basis, or do we want periods of time where we don't have that effect in the body?
This is a very astute question, and obviously because you've been interviewing for a very long time. There are immediate effects that happen with exercise. The immediate effects are some of the things that I'd mentioned, that increase in interleukin, so the increase in those myokines, and then also changes in, say, HDL and triglycerides. They're acute effects. Is that where the magic is? I would argue and say it's not, quite frankly. The magic isn't in the acute effect. It's in the multiple chronic stimulation of these things. So what do we know when we chronically stimulate this exercise piece? Well, we see actually lower levels of these inflammatory cytokines just across the board. And you would think that they would be higher. They're actually lower. We also see white blood cells in a more desirable range, which is also interesting. There was a study, the study was okay. It was called the Drew study, but it looked at some of this, and it was interesting. And so there's a potential that the white blood cells are also a bit on the lower end. And when I say lower, I would say in a more ideal range. So that becomes very interesting. But again, your question is very astute. What is the dose needed? And I think that is evolving. I think that the way in which we can look at that is that we look at the dose in terms of what is ideal for the human and what are the markers that we can measure. And we can measure strength, and we can measure body composition, and we can measure surrogate markers of muscle health like insulin resistance and glucose, or insulin, glucose, triglycerides, HDLs, HSCRP. But again, I think exercise physiology is a little bit of the Wild West as it relates to what would that specific input be. I say that, nevertheless, I think that there are particular recommendations that would be beneficial for nearly everybody. And that is number one, focus on strength first. And that could be 3 to 4 days of training, but really there should be, and there's multiple ways to get an adaptation, right? And you can talk to some of my colleagues who are specialists in exercise physiology, and they would tell you a million different ways of a well-designed program. But, from a medical perspective, focusing on strength, thinking about how do we leverage strength? Because that's very valuable. Strength doesn't mean you're necessarily going to grow bigger muscles. It can, your muscles will grow. But once you've established a baseline strength, I do think also layering on hypertrophy. And, some of my colleagues would also disagree with me when I talk about hypertrophy and what its relevance is. But hypertrophy is simply the way in which you make the muscle bigger. Initially, when we started this interview, you said, okay, well, what's the role of skeletal muscle and why do we care about it, if everyone's focused on obesity? And I said, well, skeletal muscle is the primary site for glucose disposal. How do we increase our capacity to have glucose disposal?
Put on more muscle?
You increase it through muscle. You have more muscle. You still have to train it to keep it, but the reality is you have more muscle, right? And again, Don Layman, my mentor of 20 years, we go back and forth because he said, well, it's not just the amount of muscle, that the data doesn't support that. But I would say, I think one of the reasons that we haven't done a good job about understanding the relationship of skeletal muscle and overall health is because we haven't had a great way of testing it and measuring it in a way that is clinically relevant and reproducible. We're starting to. There's going to be a way in which, I think this is out of Evan Williams' lab, or maybe it's William Evans. It's William Evans, Dr. Evans, talking about creatine. Like you can take a pill in which it labels creatine, and then you can measure creatinine as a way of measuring skeletal muscle, and that may track with an MRI. But anyway, this is a long-winded way of saying, skeletal muscle, what are is this acute or chronic? And I would say the changes are acute. We need chronic activity, and there's multiple ways of doing that.
Okay, you've touched on a lot of different points there, the acute, the chronic, the strength, the hypertrophy. What I'm curious about now is types of exercise, because we've been to this point, we've talked about resistance training, but we've basically been saying exercise. So how do you feel about using different forms such as HIIT training, going for long walks, resistance training with weights versus bands, to give people an idea of what these different inputs are going to do when it comes to muscle?
Yeah, I believe, and on my podcast, I just interviewed a phenomenal PhD. His name is Pat Davidson. And we talked a lot about this. And he said, it's what is the input that you are trying to get for the outcome, right? So if it's strength, there's multiple ways to engage strength, but really getting to a heavy lifting load, again, is it a machine like a hack squat? How do you choose an exercise? But I think heavy weight training for strength is probably irreplaceable. Could you do bands? Probably initially, right? But again, can you lift heavy enough to kind of move the needle? Likely, sorry, this is real life. This is a Friday after Thanksgiving, American Thanksgiving. And so the kids are home, everyone's screaming, but it's good.
All good.
This is good, right? This is real life. We're in it. So
totally.
Again, listen, could there be multiple ways in which you move the needle on strength? Yes, there can be. I think that a good way to think about it, however, would be how are we lifting weights? Because that can be utilized, and you're going to have to go heavy enough. Could you do that with bands? Probably up into a point, So that's one aspect. And then hypertrophy, really, again, it is about muscle fatigue, progressive overload over a period of time. So this could be, free weights, bands, machines. And I'll also mention, you said strength. I think kettlebells are also pretty awesome. Kettlebells can be used for a combination of high intensity kind of activity and also dynamic movement.
For somebody who has been struggling with weight loss and they've tried all the different diets, they've tried playing with different macronutrients and upping and lowering protein, carbs, and fat, and they've tried cutting calories, you name it, and they've just had no success, why would you want them to tune into resistance training and putting on muscle as something to break through that plateau?
Well, as we know, skeletal muscle is the organ of longevity, and there is simply nothing as effective than exercise. And specifically, when we're thinking about body recomposition, you have to think about resistance training. It is just essential because it pushes the body to adapt to stress, to really be able to utilize substrates, which when we think about a substrate, you should think about carbohydrates, fatty acids, and again, you have to utilize what you're eating. Just essential.
Well, let's get into the physiology. Say somebody is keeping their healthy diet as is for now, eliminating that variable, but they've decided to incorporate resistance training, put on muscle. What's happening physiology-wise with that increased muscle when it comes to the way the macronutrients interact with the tissue?
Yeah, I think it's a somewhat of a complex topic, right? Are you talking about muscle at rest? Are we talking about muscle post-exercise? Are we talking about muscle post-feeding? But in order to kind of frame it appropriately, let's start with what muscle does, especially when we think about a metabolic perspective. Skeletal muscle is the primary site for fatty acid oxidation. It is the primary site for glucose disposal, insulin-related glucose disposal. That's important. It's also a primary site for non-insulin related glucose disposal, meaning through physical activity, the body does not require insulin. I think that your listeners know all about insulin, but let's say that they didn't. Insulin is a hormone released from the pancreas. You must release insulin to move blood sugar out of the bloodstream into tissues. And we know that elevated levels of blood sugar over time, that's the definition of diabetes. It can be extremely damaging to kidneys, to vasculature, to limbs, everything, right? Diabetes is a disease that the consequences of that are really significant. So skeletal muscle, again, as this primary site for your metabolism. Now, what is also in skeletal muscle? Skeletal muscle is, again, the primary site for also mitochondria. When we think about aging, and quite simply, we think about energy. The less mitochondria you have, the less energy you're going to have. And you can actually directly influence mitochondria through the health of skeletal muscle. That becomes very important. The other aspects of skeletal muscle are through the contraction of the tissue. And that would be through, again, endurance training, resistance training, any kind of exercise releases myokines. And myokines would be considered a hormone released from skeletal muscle. The big ones are interleukin 6. That's probably the most famous, interleukin 15, and cathepsin B, irisin. I'm sure that people have kind of heard a little bit about this, but they influence the release of BDNF in the brain, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And I think that that's important to understand, that contracting skeletal muscle, releasing these myokines actually also changes the way fuels and substrates are utilized. So it's not just through the exercise itself, which is what people typically think, but it is also through the influence of skeletal muscle as an endocrine organ.
So we do a strength training exercise. Myokines are released locally and then systemically through the bloodstream.
Yes.
They're going to travel. And you mentioned the BDNF factor. So they're going to actually go through the blood-brain barrier, enter the brain.
Well, actually, it increases BDNF within the brain.
Right. Don't they travel through the bloodstream,
No.
through the blood-brain barrier to the brain?
The majority of BDNF is actually released within the brain, and it's stimulated by cathepsin B, which is in the blood, and irisin, which is in the blood.
Okay, well, let's talk about where myokines interact with that. Take me through the whole pathway to make sure I understand that.
Well, there's hundreds of different myokines. There are just hundreds and hundreds of different myokines. I think that there's going to be many that we don't even, there's going to be many that are yet to be discovered. where I really think about the importance of exercise and from a myokine release, I think about three specific effects that different myokines have. Number one, the effect on the immune system. So interleukin 6 and interleukin 15, we think about cytokine storm or these interleukins released from macrophages as that relates to a cytokine and just chronic or acute infection in nature, right? Well, when these myokines are released from skeletal muscle, they actually have an anti-inflammatory effect. So they counterbalance some of this systemic inflammation over time. And they interface with the immune system. And that is pretty fascinating, this idea that exercise actually interfaces with the immune system. The other really fascinating part about it is that interleukin 6 from skeletal muscle acts differently in the body than interleukin 6 from the immune cells. One creates an inflammatory effect. The other one is somewhat anti-inflammatory. And it's incredible. So you're leveraging skeletal muscle to balance this immune system regulation. The other aspect about myokines really comes down to, in my mind, interleukin 6. And interleukin 6 actually affects the liver. It affects adipose tissue. And when you think about its effect on the liver, it is really impactful in the way in which it utilizes fat. So you can actually use more fat when you're releasing interleukin 6. And I'm saying this quite simply. It is somewhat of a complex process, but again, to simplify it, this idea that contracting skeletal muscle, it's not just about burning calories. It's not just about creating energy flux within the tissue, leveraging glycogen and then creating energy flux, but also the influence of interleukin 6 on lipolysis and things of that nature.
All right. To make sure I have this correctly, there's 3 different parts you broke down there. The BDNF, the immune system impact, and the third one when it comes to myokines is the breakdown of fat in the liver.
Yes. And and interleukin 6 has, again, multiple roles, but in a low glycogen state, there's some evidence to suggest that potentially interleukin 6 may even have more of an impact.
All right, let's come back to the BDNF part here, because I still am not totally clear on this. So say we do bicep curls, and we use that as our form of resistance training just for this example. Myokines are released. They go into the bloodstream. How do they get to the brain, and how do they cause that BDNF to be released?
In the brain. So they exist and are released in the brain. Yeah.
All right. So the release in the brain, let's take that story even further. For people that aren't familiar with BDNF, why this is so important.
So BDNF is brain-derived neurotropic factor, and it is thought to help with neurogenesis and really the regulation and the health of neurons and brain function. And, neurons relate to brain function. The other aspect of that, which I think is not totally talked about often, is this idea that the healthier your metabolism is, typically the healthier that your brain is. Again, I realize that I'm making a very linear statement, but I did my training in obesity medicine and geriatrics. And one of the things that we looked at was body composition and brain volume. We looked at older individuals, older I say, 50s, and those individuals that really had issues with obesity, definitely you saw that on their brain. And that's actually where the concept of muscle-centric medicine came from, was this interface between obesity and brain function. It was an aha moment.
So what you're saying here, to be clear, somebody who is carrying extra body weight, their brain is going to be physically smaller.
There's a chance that it could be. There is a risk factor. Obesity is a risk factor for Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. I mean, Alzheimer's could be thought of as type 3 diabetes of the brain.
Let's come back to myokines. So when we talked about them before, we talked about the liver aspect, the immune system, and the BDNF.
Yeah.
What about locally in the muscle?
I mean, locally in the muscle, again, there is possibility. Again, there's hundreds of different myokines, but it affects substrate utilization. Meaning, again, the way in which, quite just to simplify, how you have healthy skeletal muscle is really creating a flux. Unhealthy skeletal muscle is muscle that is untrained or sedentary, and what happens is it's almost like a suitcase. You open up the suitcase and you pack a bunch of carbohydrates in, and that carbohydrates, you could call that glycogen. After a period of time, when you open up the suitcase and you haven't unpacked it, you can't just keep packing more stuff in there. And ultimately, you get this infiltration of triglycerides and other ceramides, all kinds, diacylglycerol, all kinds of intermediates. But ultimately, it leads to intramuscular fat. And that really becomes a negative aspect on metabolism, energy, mitochondria, and just muscle health and tissue in general. Again, myokines, very complex, but the local influence of myokines will help with this substrate utilization and also potentially have lower levels of inflammation.
I like this suitcase analogy. So what you said there is that we can look at the muscle like a suitcase with glycogen being packed in, and we use resistance training to utilize that glycogen and make more room for glycogen to come back in the future. But things become a problem and muscle tissue becomes unhealthy when we're not using that muscle and using up that glycogen, and we continue to have things like carbohydrates and starches, and you're going to elevate blood glucose, and glycogen's going to be full, and you're going to have nowhere really to put it.
And what is also really important to understand about this conversation is we always talk about obesity, and we think about obesity as something out there, and that's something that needs to be fixed, as if that is the source of the problem. Obesity is not the source of the problem. You see issues with insulin resistance in skeletal muscle decades before you see obesity and all the other diseases that ride along with it. Insulin resistance is a risk factor for diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease. All these metabolic dysfunctions we put on obesity, when in fact we should put on skeletal muscle. It's a skeletal muscle issue at its core, not an obesity issue. Again, obesity is a symptom of unhealthy skeletal muscle. The other component to that is these changes can begin so much earlier than we had thought, right? Again, I think with this resurgence of the conversation around cardiovascular disease, people used to think cardiovascular disease was kind of this disease later on in life, but we know that it begins much earlier. Plaque, hard, soft plaque begins much earlier. The same thing with skeletal muscle. The dysfunction in skeletal muscle also begins much earlier.
Let's come back to the insulin resistance piece and talk about specifically why maintaining healthy muscle is an important piece of this, because this is a subject that comes up time and time again on the show. And to give a really brief overview, this is when we're having carbohydrates, elevating our blood glucose, and then insulin is trying to drive that into the cells.
Right.
And over time, the body is going to compensate if their blood glucose remains high chronically, continue to make more insulin. And earlier you talked about some of the negative impacts of having high blood glucose, the toxicity on the body. There's also the increased insulin and the problems that causes as well.
Yeah.
So let's talk specifically about muscle and why. And we're there's some overlap here, but let's talk about addressing insulin resistance with resistance training and building muscle.
When you think about insulin resistance, you have to, in my mind, break it down to where are the sites, what tissues are affected by insulin. And the tissues, many tissues are affected by insulin, but what are the really insulin-sensitive tissues? Insulin-sensitive tissues, you think about skeletal muscle, you think about liver, you think about even potentially adipose tissue, right? And based on the size of the organ system, skeletal muscle makes up 40% of your body's weight, right? This is the largest endocrine organ in the body. And it is directly sensitive and utilizes insulin, needs insulin to, again, move glucose out of the bloodstream into the cell. This is the only tissue that you have direct control over. That's it. You cannot think your liver to work harder. You cannot think anything else to work harder, but you can actively train skeletal muscle. And being the largest site for glucose disposal and an insulin-sensitive tissue at rest, then this is where you really have to target. So again, if you want to get into the specifics, there's a GLUT4 receptor that is an insulin-sensitive GLUT4 receptor that leverages insulin to move glucose out of the bloodstream into the cell. And when a exercising muscle is utilizing glucose, it does not require insulin. And this is the primary site for disposal. You have to have the data is clear that once you lose healthy skeletal muscle, you see increases in insulin resistance and increases in blood glucose.
Okay, to make sure I understand that correctly, because there's some nuance there. Skeletal muscle, you've mentioned this a couple times, does not require insulin to bring the glucose into the muscle.
Exercising. At rest, it does.
Yes, right. There's two parts to it.
Yeah.
So when we do resistance training, what I'm wanting clarification on here is it that we're clearing out the glycogen for the non-insulin glucose to come in, and we're putting on more muscle through resistance training, which is going to build more of a sink for even when we're using insulin to clear the blood glucose.
I really like the way that you're thinking about it. There's this huge argument that it's not really about muscle mass. It's all about strength. I would argue that I don't agree with that. I think it is a combination of strength, but I do think that the size and the mass really matters.
So this comes back to our suitcase. We're exercising a muscle. Again, we'll use the bicep. We're clearing out glycogen. So we're making room for glucose to come in from the bloodstream without insulin. Plus, over time, as we build up that volume of muscle, we're going to be able to use insulin because there's more volume to store. We can pull more glucose and regulate the blood glucose better long term.
Well, I would think that, number one, glucose is a fail-safe mechanism, not something that should be utilized all the time. I really, we think about insulin as something that is normal to utilize frequently, and I don't totally believe that we should be using it as much as we do, if that makes sense. It's a fail-safe mechanism. You don't want high levels of insulin. You don't want to create this, a robust response. You don't want to eat a bunch of glucose and have a robust response of insulin and then a subsequent drop in blood sugar, right? And then an increase in catecholamines. And then it's just like this ebb and flow of blood sugar, and it makes you tired and cranky. I think that that's a real negative. Where it becomes important is that if you eat carbohydrates, you have to have a place that is healthy, metabolically healthy to store it, and that would be skeletal muscle. Challenges happen as you age, or if you're on bed rest, or if you are really sedentary and you are losing skeletal muscle over time, then you become metabolically more unhealthy. And there's evidence to support that the loss of muscle mass is potentially even more detrimental than the gain of body fat.
So as you're talking about carbohydrates, I want to be clear, you're not anti-carb though. You
No.
clearly depict in the book, you're protein first when it comes to diet, then carbohydrates, and then fill in the blanks at the end with fats. And I think this is a good point to break down the diet piece and get into some of the specifics here, starting with protein and what you recommend to make it really easy for people. Take your body weight in pounds and aim for roughly that in grams of protein.
Yeah.
And then we'll take it from there and get into the other macros.
Here, so I'm going to tell you how about I tell you how I design my diet?
Please.
And this would be super easy for people. And again, I actually did a whole solo cast on this. I don't know, have you ever done a solo cast? I did my very first ever solo cast. And it was on this because that's what people really care about is how is it relevant for them? How do they design a diet for them? First thing that you have to think about is that there's no perfect way to do it. There is going to be some trial and error. We have to know where we're at to know where we're going. The first thing that I would recommend someone do, is to actually track what they are eating for 2 weeks. Figure out exactly what you are doing and notice, are you weight stable? Has your weight remained the same? Figure out, let's say you're at 2,000 calories and that's kind of where you are. So you understand where you're at right now and assuming that you are weight stable. The next thing that you have to think about is If you want to lose weight, and depending on how much weight you want to lose, there has to be a calorie deficit. That calorie deficit could be 30%, it could be 20%, slow and steady. The more weight you have to lose, the higher the calorie deficit. The less weight you have to lose, the lower the calorie deficit, because steady weight loss over time allows you to maintain lean tissue. Notice I didn't just say muscle. Lean tissue is organs, bone, it's everything, including skeletal muscle. Now, if you are wanting to put on muscle, then you would go into somewhat of a calorie surplus. And I think there's some controversy out there, but you do need calories. You do need food to put on skeletal muscle. And typically that would be anywhere from a 10 to 20% calorie surplus. Now, after you figure that out, I think the next question to ask yourself is, how much do you want to weigh? You have to know how much you weigh, and then you have to ask yourself, how much do you actually want to weigh? For me, I'm a small person. I'm about 110 pounds, believe it or not, 5'1", and I have about 120 grams of protein, just because I'm super physically active, and that's where I start. So a great place to start, and the literature would support 0.7 to 1 gram per pound ideal body weight, which is double what is recommended as the minimum to prevent deficiencies. We can all agree that the minimum to prevent deficiencies, which has not changed since 1968, is still 0.8 grams per kilogram. Again, a better range is to figure out where you want to weigh and shoot for that. And that would be, again, 0.7 to 1 gram per pound ideal body weight. The next thing that you have to think about is how you're going to distribute that protein. In a protein hierarchy, really, the most important is that 24-hour protein consumption. But I would argue that there may be some benefit to thinking about a plan of how you distribute to that. And that would really ultimately depend on your goal and how much protein you have to get in. In my book, I have a longevity track, and those are for people that really like where they're at and they just want to eat the correct macros to maintain their body composition over time. And what we do know is that the first meal of the day is the most studied, and especially from a muscle protein synthesis response, especially from a metabolic response. That first meal of the day is the meal that is easy to test, and it's the one where all the literature is really based off. To my knowledge, I haven't seen literature that looks at initiation factors and muscle protein synthesis very clearly at those second and subsequent meals, which I think is important to point out, because these recommendations, it's how do we make recommendations that benefit people over time? So that's a very long-winded way of saying the first meal of the day is very critical to get right. And whatever your protein need is, I still believe that first meal should be between a minimum of 30 grams of protein to upwards of 50 grams at that first meal.
We're going to get into the nuances. I want to pause you there because there's a lot to get into that you've already shared.
There's a lot I just said, I know.
I want to take it right back to the beginning when you talked about the first step for somebody is to go 2 weeks, journal what they are eating. And if they want to lose weight, they're going to need to get into a calorie deficit. I just want to push back on that point a little bit and say, what if this person is sedentary and they start including resistance training like we're talking about today, but keep the calories the same? Isn't there a good chance at that point they're going to start losing the weight without playing with the diet?
There's some really, really cool hallmark studies that I would say, you definitely will lose weight in a calorie deficit if you're just increasing resistance training. Again, depends on, I'm sure it would improve body composition, but to the extent I don't really know. But yeah, I can't think of a study off the top of my head because all the studies that I really look at are either weight loss or obesity or a combination of resistance training and the synergistic effect of dietary protein. But yes, if someone were to eat the same way as they do and do resistance training, would you see some benefit? Yes, you certainly would.
And I'm not advocating for that. Obviously, we want to do all we can to
No,
get our
it's probably not the best
body
strategy.
composition in a good place, but it's just for looking at the science and the physiology. I'm picturing somebody who is carrying maybe 20 extra pounds of fat, and they have a typical type, office job. They come home and they
Mhm.
have dinner with their family, maybe watch some TV, barely moving their body, but then they go and continue everything like they're doing,
Mhm.
but resistance train 3 days a week. My guess is 6 months down the road, they're going to have profound changes in how their body looks, and they're going to, burnt a lot of body fat from coming back to what we talked about before, putting on muscle and all the different benefits they're going to get.
Yeah, and I do want to highlight that actually skeletal muscle at rest is not very metabolically active or demanding. It is the reason skeletal muscle plays. I believe it's about 30% of resting metabolic rate, which is it's not huge. I mean, the brain is upwards of 20 something percent, and that's much smaller. So it's really the mass, the size of skeletal muscle. But at rest, it's not incredibly active from just an energy demand standpoint. It's really the activity that is required to get the muscle, the activity, when you're also eating dietary protein at a threshold amount, it stimulates muscle tissue, which there's that thermic effect of feeding. But there's also this muscle protein synthetic response, which is a bit energy demanding. And those are some of the ways in which I think about skeletal muscle really pushes the lever. And these are really great questions, Jesse. So I appreciate it.
We're going to get to the breakfast and the muscle protein synthesis. But before we do, another piece on the calorie deficit. And whenever I hear those two words, I think about shifting the basal metabolic rate. So if we start cutting back calories, it seems like there's a group of people that push back against that right away. And I'm kind of on the fence here. I don't have the science to back this up. But if we start cutting back calories, say we do that over 6 months as a strategy to lose weight, won't the basal metabolic rate just come down and rebalance?
So what you're talking about is adaptive thermogenesis. Yes, a strategy of just cutting calories to lose weight is likely not an ideal strategy over the long haul. But dietary protein has been shown to have some counterbalance to this adaptive thermogenesis for some of the reasons that I had just mentioned.
All right, I want to take a pivot here and move into fueling the muscle. So let's get into the dietary piece. And we could break this up into a couple different parts. One being how we fuel to exercise and put on muscle, and then fueling the body in general to sustain.
Yeah, I think a good rule of thumb is, putting on muscle typically will require a protein, a certain amount of protein, right? It'd be very difficult to put, if not, maybe nothing is impossible, but be very difficult to put on muscle in a calorie deficit as a rule. Could some people do it? Yeah, but I would say a more effective way for putting on muscle would be really optimizing for dietary protein and understanding where your baseline calories are, and then incrementally going up by 10%. How do you determine baseline calories? There's multiple ways in which you can go online. My very dear friend, Alan Argon, has a great calculator. You can determine calories. And then obviously increasing dietary protein is so valuable, again, above. So I typically recommend a gram per pound ideal body weight. If you are looking to put on muscle, you can go higher than that. And then if you were looking for muscle glycogen repletion from training, carbohydrate intake, you can easily do a 1-to-1 ratio of protein to carbohydrates. And then fat, people will argue, is it carbohydrates or fat that's more important? And I would say, listen, focus on protein, then focus on carbohydrates, and then focus on fat.
All right, that gives us a great overview. I really want to take some time and get into the nuances, starting with protein. This is an area you can talk extensively on, and an area I haven't really delved into a lot over the years on the show. So let's get into that. And I think a good point to start off is the fact that when people are looking at nutrition labels, all they're seeing is protein and how many grams.
Doesn't that blow your
And
mind?
that is just such a big umbrella term because there's 20 amino acids. There's 9 essential amino acids, which we can only get through the diet.
Yeah.
So let's break this down and talk
Isn't that
about
crazy though?
protein.
Like
It
how did
is.
no one brought that up before? How is it that that you look at a label and we talk about protein as this one nebulous thing, but really it's 20 different amino acids, yet that's not really represented in the labels. It's really interesting.
Well, let's get into the nuances. Somebody that wants to take good care and make sure they're getting all the amino acids in the right ratio, because labels aren't really going to tell them that. Actually, they're not going to tell them that. How do they go about looking at that?
It's tricky, right? So I don't know what the labeling law is in Canada, but typically there's a percent daily value. So you'll be able to kind of calculate, and listen, no one's going to do this. I'm not even do this. You can kind of calculate if it's, how many grams of protein, and then the percent daily value will be significantly like low if it is a low quality protein. But I think a good rule of thumb is to understand that if it's a high quality protein, meaning if it's an animal based, is it beef, chicken, fish, eggs, dairy, whey, that the label that what you're looking at is typically relevant, right? So if it says 20 grams of protein, it's 20 grams of protein, but if you were to look at something like hemp protein and it says 20 grams of protein, you'd probably want to cut that in half. So even though it says 20 grams of protein, because of the amino acid discrepancies, you're probably looking at the body recognizing about 10 grams of protein. So if it's a plant-based protein, it's, you could cut it in half, or maybe, think about it in terms of it's like 75% maybe.
And how do you feel about protein powder supplementing a diet,
great.
a healthy, well-balanced diet?
Yeah. I always believe that a whole foods diet is best. That being said, I'm very busy. For the listener, I have 2 screaming children in the background, which I profusely apologize. It's nap time. But don't worry, we have help there. And working on getting the babies down for a nap. I'm really busy, so I might drink a whey protein shake. Easy, right? So I know that I drink it all at once. I'm knocking out my protein intake. I think that I do have some concerns about the rice pea blends. And why do I have that? Whey exists in nature. So let's say whey protein is processed, or, like a whey isolate might be processed. I can appreciate that. But a whey concentrate, you get that in nature, right? Whey does exist in nature. I have no data to support this, but I can tell you from a provider standpoint, and just from someone who, I trained in nutrition, professional training for 7 years in nutrition, plus clinical experience and blah, 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 and a fellowship, is that when you take something natural and then you adulterate it in a way where you isolate it, for example, pea, and you make something that doesn't exist from like you make a pea into a protein and you give this isolated compound that doesn't exist in nature, I have concerns. I have concerns no matter how you do that, right? No matter what food it is. If we did that to a red meat component or whatever it is, I think that when you make something that doesn't exist in nature, when you take a whole food and you create it in a way to augment food, I think that pea has estrogen-like activity. I think that there's compounds that perhaps we shouldn't be getting in those high doses over a lifetime would be concerning for me.
And I've heard people talk about the number of peas you would need to condense down to make a bag of that protein.
A lot.
And I've also heard about the concerns of contaminants within those plant-based proteins when you're taking such a large volume and condensing it down.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say I agree with all those things. And those things are concerning. But again, if you think about it in cycles, and let's say someone is more vegan or vegetarian, then, I can appreciate that that's a way to utilize plant-based protein without such an increase in caloric load. Can totally be done. Yeah. So, but I do have concerns, right? I have logical concerns that I think are valid.
One thing I've heard you talk about is the fact that the first meal of the day, we want to make sure we're getting a good bolus of protein. So What does that look like, and why is that so important?
The traditional research in dietary protein really stems from that first meal of the day. So really all the data has all been at breakfast. It typically is not done at lunch or at dinner. And the reason is it's just easy from a scientific standpoint to be able to leverage that first meal of the day because it doesn't have all those compounding variables. You're coming off of an overnight fast. And so the data for muscle protein synthesis typically is really the primary point is that first meal of the day. It allows for, whether someone is doing a clamp or someone is doing like a muscle biopsy. And so the majority of the research has really identified that first meal is very valuable, right? And that's where the data has typically come from out of Don Layman's lab and many others. So why is it so important? Well, number one, we have evidence to support the impact that it has on muscle protein synthesis. And muscle protein synthesis is a surrogate for, it's not a direct correlation. So you don't stimulate muscle protein synthesis one time and all of a sudden you have like a bicep that looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's not what that is. But muscle protein synthesis is the best marker that we have for the laying down of new proteins over time, right? And muscle protein synthesis is very robust at that first meal, coming off of an overnight fast where essentially the skeletal muscle is catabolic in an unfed state. And that first meal, you will likely get the biggest influence from the amino acids. Because, we don't really know what happens. It's very difficult for us to look at dinner and lunch. But that first meal, we know. And so we know that coming off after an overnight fast, that the muscle is primed for nutrients. It's hungry, essentially, and primed for nutrients. And really hitting 30 to 50 grams to stimulate that muscle protein synthesis is ideal. And that number really comes from an amino acid threshold. And the amino acid particularly is leucine. And if you are plant-based, you'll need to go to the 50 grams or higher. If you are more animal-based high-quality proteins, 30 to 50 grams would be ideal.
I want to get into the nuance of this a little bit more. So we got muscle protein synthesis. So we're having this bolus of protein. Is this basically the laying down and the building up of our current muscle?
Muscle protein synthesis over time, that's the belief. So over time, muscle protein synthesis is the laying down and building up. But again, I caution the listener to think about it that way because it's very incremental. It's very incremental over a period of time.
And I'm curious for somebody that does a workout, say the day before, versus somebody that isn't working out or they've just taken a break and they're not working out, for a few days, how does that protein impact the muscle differently in those two different states?
So if someone is not working out versus working out, well, you can't.
Yeah, picture somebody that worked out the day before and then they hit that protein bolus the next morning versus somebody that's taken a break a few days from working out or they're a sedentary person. How is that going to interact with the muscle differently?
Again, a great question. Definitely asked by a seasoned interviewer. The sedentary muscle, from my perspective overall, is unhealthy muscle. Sedentary muscle is typically muscle that's already kind of saturated full of glycogen, fatty acid substrates like diacylglycerol, those kinds of things. However, I will say that muscle still needs amino acids. It needs amino acids for recovery and repair, even if, you're not totally utilizing it. Because skeletal muscle does go through a turnover process, right? There's tissue turnover in every part of the body. Again, a minimum of 250 grams a day we're probably turning over. So a non-exercising muscle that is fasted is still primed for muscle protein synthesis. But again, this is a very nuanced question. Is that sedentary muscle obese? If it is, it's probably going to take more protein to actually create a stimulus effect. But if the person is lean, a 30 to 50 gram amount would be perfectly adequate. Now, let's take this one step further. If an individual is an older muscle, so let's say it's an older individual who is sedentary, I still recommend this bolus amount of protein. And I'd probably push them to the higher end of, say, 50 grams of protein. And the reason is because it will trigger a response that would be essentially youthful, like a youthful response, meaning muscle is this nutrient sensing organ. Its capacity to sense nutrient decreases as an individual ages. There's some question whether that is true or if it's just inactivity. But either way, if you are sedentary and obese, 50 grams. If you are older and or obese or not obese, 50 grams. If you are younger and healthy and active, you can get away with 30 grams.
From your experience, how many people do you feel like are hitting even that 30-gram threshold?
Yeah. So the NHANES data, which is the largest data set, would suggest that, 50% of women over the age, I think it's like over the age of 50, are not meeting their dietary protein needs. Don't quote me on that, but it's something like that the average woman is getting 68 grams of protein a day, and the average male, according to this NHANES data set, is getting about 100 grams of protein.
And this can tie back to what we talked about before, the whey protein, the plant-based protein powders.
Yeah.
And then I want to get into now the branched chain amino acid supplement. Are you a fan of those?
I'm a fan if you're vegan or vegetarian. If
Okay,
you're vegan or
talk more about
vegetarian,
that.
that would be the way to utilize a branch. So the branched chain amino acids are leucine, isoleucine, and valine. They are essential amino acids that you have to get from the diet, although arguably maybe the gut microbiome, if you are a unicorn, may make that. But for the majority of people, the branched chain amino acids must come from the diet. And typically a vegan or vegetarian diet is lower protein quality, just simply meaning that it's lower in these essential amino acids. The way to kind of compensate for that, again, this compensates for the amino acid component. It doesn't necessarily compensate for the iron or the creatine or the taurine or the anserine or some of these other components, but certainly the way in which you can account for it for a protein, from a protein aspect, is by adding in a scoop of branched chain amino acids to that lower quality meal.
So can we look at that supplement as basically the other protein powders, the whey and the plant-based, are taken from food one step down? Would the branched chain amino acids be an isolate almost from like a protein powder?
So it depends on where the branched chain comes from. I think it's some, companies, they are, comes from like silkworm or wherever. There's, I don't, not really up to date on where they're coming from.
How do you feel about
the
association between amino acids and cancer? There's research out there talking about that.
Yeah.
And then I want you to address it from two different points. Amino acids from the diet versus supplementing, where we're going to get in a more concentrated form.
It's a really interesting question. And I think that this has been going on for a long time. And I would say before this paper that came out in 2016 in Cell, it was pretty much like put to bed, the connection between amino acids and cancer. So first of all, let's talk about cancer. So cancer is a disease of the genome. And there's initiation factors and there's promoting factors. An initiation factor of what causes cancer is a defect in the genome. That's not caused by something that you eat, right? Like you're not going to directly impact an initiation factor from an amino acid to cause cancer. So there's that. Then the next question is, what kind of cancer are we talking about? Are we talking about breast, uterine, ovarian, lung, prostate? And I think that needs to be discussed, right? So what kind of cancer are we talking about? And aside from a genetic component, what is the biggest risk factor for cancer? Do you know one of the biggest risk factors for cancers?
Oh, so many. Obesity. Environment.
Hey, you stop there. Obesity, the one thing that we could have control over, right?
Yeah.
So if we talk about
environment too, but
I mean, I don't know. I
to a point.
Control. Yeah. I mean, I live right outside New York City. When I lived in New York City, there's no way I could, as much as I put like air filters in, there's only so much I can do, right? But the concept that, number one, cancer is a disease of the genome. And number two, what kind of cancers are we talking about? And number three, where is the connection? So again, and what is the risk? So one of the major risk factors of cancer, depending on what kind, is obesity. Do you know one of the other major risks of dying from cancer is?
Old age?
Cancer cachexia. So
which could be associated with old age.
So cancer cachexia is muscle wasting.
Right. I guess that's why I'm associating with old age. A lot of people as they age have less muscle on the body, but That's more directly from the cancer. Go ahead.
Exactly. So the skeletal muscle is actually what can improve survivability from cancer. Cancer cachexia, regardless of the kind of cancer, has a high probability of killing someone. So basically, how do you support muscle?
Resistance train.
And?
Eat the right foods.
Which are?
Protein.
So basically, you're telling me one of the biggest risk factors, if I'm hearing you correctly, is obesity, right? Aside from genetic. And then to help survivability, you have to protect muscle. So those are the obvious logical things. And then somehow, miraculously, there's this conversation of dietary protein and cancer. So to me, from a geriatrician perspective, so that means I take care of, trained, fellowship trained from WashU in individuals over the age of 65. To me, that doesn't make sense, right? So sarcopenia, muscle mass, and all this other stuff. And so if we were to now go back to your original question, what's the connection between cancer and protein? And this really comes down to this one mechanistic pathway, which is mechanistic target of rapamycin. It's called mTOR, and there's mTOR1 and mTOR2. And mTOR1 is in every tissue in the body. Your brain, your pancreas, your liver, your muscle. Mechanistic target of rapamycin is exquisitely sensitive to nutrients. It's a growth promoter. It's sensitive to insulin. It's sensitive to excess calories. It's sensitive to exercise. And the sensitivity is different in every tissue, right? You with me so far? This is critical. mTOR, when chronically overstimulated, is considered a growth promoter and can be a problem if someone has cancer. If somebody already has cancer. So if someone has cancer, then growth promotion is a problem. Okay. So what do we do? So if you believe that to be true, then let's talk about the impact of mTOR on the tissues. So one of the worst things for mechanistic target of rapamycin in the space of cancer is to be chronically stimulated and overstimulated. The major way to do that is through excess calories, excess insulin, and excess carbohydrates. Liver, pancreas. When it comes to protein, mTOR is exquisitely sensitive to amino acids in skeletal muscle only. So protein stimulates mTOR primarily only in skeletal muscle. So the connection is, like if they were going to be able to prove that, then we should see some randomized controlled trials that dietary protein and its relationship to cancer, and that's never been proven. And in fact, when the information has been analyzed and we look at relative risk or risk ratio, it's never been shown to be clinically relevant, like ever.
One little thing within that I want to tease out is, isn't it true, though, if somebody was to take in an abundance of protein through gluconeogenesis, that could be converted to glucose in the system and then impact the system differently?
Great question. I would say that excess protein definitely can get converted to, and just protein in general. So protein in general gets converted to glucose, but it's much less efficient than eating straight carbohydrates. And also the impact on insulin is it's a phase 1 insulin response. So if you gave 50 grams of dietary protein and 50 grams of glucose, the insulin responses would be vastly different. But yeah, absolutely. And I think that when you have, so for every 100 grams of dietary protein, you'll convert to 60 grams of glucose through gluconeogenesis, which is a much slower process and a way to maintain blood sugar levels without constantly eating carbohydrates.
Another little piece I want to make sure we tease out while we're in the weeds on this is the supplements of amino acids versus having that through whole foods, because obviously it's going to hit the system a lot harder if we're having that in a supplement form condensed.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that in the whole conversation around cancer?
Again, I think the question is do I feel that protein has a role in cancer? I don't. I feel that cancer is a disease of the genome. I think a risk factor is being overweight. I think a risk factor is excess calories. It's not a protein issue, right?
No, that's why it's good that you're teasing this out. You're the expert in this area, so it's good that we're getting into this because, branched chain amino acids are getting a bad rap, at least in certain circles. So it's important we hash this out.
It's unfortunate. And, you have to understand is branched chain amino acids are going to be elevated in the blood with someone who's obese, but also insulin, glucose, every substance, is going to be, these substances are all going to be elevated because it's, there's a dysregulation in the metabolism. Gluconeogenesis is not shutting down. It's if you become insulin resistant, you have excess glucose, This is not a protein problem. The only reason it becomes a protein problem is because people believe that you shouldn't be eating dietary protein. And I think the question is why? And unfortunately, I think that one would have to look at what is the agenda behind that. And I think that it can be very devastating for people's health. I think the worst piece of advice you could ever give someone who's aging is to reduce their dietary protein. It's hands down the worst piece of advice in the prime protecting years of skeletal muscle that you could ever give someone is to fast and eat low protein.
Let's talk about dosage. We talked about the bolus of protein, the importance in the morning. If somebody is going to either through supplements or through diet take in that protein, how long does it sit around in the system? And then how does this tie into when we're going to train?
I think that it doesn't really matter. Protein prior to training, you don't need because, again, you stimulate the tissue through resistance exercise. So, the evidence that ISSN, so the International Society for Sports Nutrition, their recommendation is it's more relevant the 24-hour period of dietary protein. So from my perspective, you don't need protein prior to training. People would argue it doesn't matter when you eat protein afterwards, but I would say if you are older, if you have any kind of inflammatory process, if you are overweight or obese, I think that you benefit from protein post-training, whether it's 30, 90 minutes. I think that your muscle is primed for nutrients. I think that you can also, you've stimulated the tissue. So the tissue, at least from the aging research, is more likely to respond like a more youthful tissue. I think that there's value in that. And I also think that, let's say worst case scenario, we don't have value in that. There's no harm in creating a habit that allows for executing and getting your protein dose. I think that there's no downside.
Okay, so we have this common thread of getting the protein bolus in the morning. My question now is, does it matter when in the morning? Because there's so much talk these days about the health benefits of intermittent fasting, pushing breakfast, and then there's a lot of talk I'm finding more lately of eating breakfast and skipping dinner. So let's open up the conversation on intermittent fasting. Are you a fan ever? Is it something you practice, and how does it fit into this whole protein equation?
Thanks for this question. I was a fan until I was a fan of fasting all day and having my meals later at night until I really looked at some of the research with Christine Holmes. She's amazing. She's a female PhD, and we work with very similar groups in terms of special operations and individuals in high stress situations. And she was saying, listen, Gabrielle, everyone is talking about fasting during the day and then eating, say, at like 1, 2 o'clock and then eating into the night, which was what I would do. I would fast till noon and then eat till 8 and then stop. And she said, the circadian biology data doesn't support that. And she also said that the circadian biology data would support eating earlier on and stopping when the sun goes down. So front loading your intermittent fasting window earlier. I have yet to do that, but that would be the next thing on my list. It's harder because then you have to actually be able to control your hunger by yourself, as opposed to, you're still in that, whatever hunger control phase. And then, once you start eating, you're hungry. So I have been rethinking my fasting strategies, but I've not yet implemented.
And we could tie this new fasting strategy that you're yet to try
Yeah,
to sleep, because it's often recommended to take a few hours, at least 3 or 4 hours before
exactly
going to
right.
bed, to let the food digest
That's
and get a
exactly
better
right.
sleep that way. Where I want to go with this, let's tie sleep to muscle building. So we've talked about the resistance training, we've gotten into the nutrition. This is another pillar here that we need to consider. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think that obviously during the times of recovery is key. You're not growing when you're training, you're growing when you're recovering. Um, so sleep is essential, and it's essential for a multitude of reasons, especially from a physician standpoint. It's essential for brain function, it's essential for nervous system regulation, it's essential for stress management, right? All these things are super critical. But again, also growth and metabolic regulation, right? We know that night shift workers really struggle with glucose regulation and insulin, regardless if they're isocaloric, meaning if they have the same amount of calories, and they're just flipping their sleep wake cycle. I mean, there's problems. So sleep is essential. It's also the time that the brain cleans itself.
So it's something you prioritize.
I'm a mom of two. I do the best I can. Two very little children, but when I can, I do. For sure. Again, we all have cycles, right? There's always, are you in a push cycle? What is the season of your life? But if people can prioritize sleep, I think it's even more valuable than we recognize.
Well, while you're on the topic of cycles, let's talk about different phases of life and the importance of resistance training during those different phases. So let's start young. You're
Yeah,
somebody with young kids. At
yeah.
what age would you recommend somebody start to, maybe work out in front of their kids, spark that interest? And when would it be too young for them to work out?
I mean, I've always worked out with my kids either strapped on me or with them. And my daughter is a little over 3 and my son is 20 months. So I worked out with them in my womb and I worked out with them when they were born and I strapped them to my chest and we do family yoga every night. We always do a push-up challenge. We do physical activity all the time. It's very critical because the female really sets the stage for the unborn child. The more physically fit she is, there is potential that translates over to the health of the child, and that you're born with a certain, like birth weight determines grip strength, which grip strength is a marker for, certain marker for health and all kinds of things like mortality, all that stuff. And I will say that there's a natural strength. I was just talking to Dr. Samuel Buckner, and he is out of the University of South Florida, and he runs a muscle physiology lab, and he looks at the input of resistance and strength on all things muscle hypertrophy. And we had a really interesting conversation, and the conversation was really that you develop natural strength in adolescence. So as strong as you are going to become from an untrained perspective, like, for example, if you and I were to get on a bench press, one of us, like if we're exactly the same size, one of us is going to have more natural strength. And that really natural strength is kind of what you build when you are in adolescent and young adulthood. And it's a way in which you are developing your tissue. And once that window closes, you don't actually develop more natural strength.
Wow. And at what age does that window close?
Probably when puberty's over.
So that's a window as a parent, you'd want to encourage your kids to be physically active, resistance train, and build that foundation.
Yeah. I mean, we do it all the time. Poor kids. They have a great time, like it's great. Super valuable.
Let's come back to something we touched on before, but I want to get into greater detail. We talked
Okay.
about MPS and one of the triggers being exercise.
Mm-hmm.
Let's now talk about somebody wanting to time that through exercise and their eating to make sure they're getting the biggest bang for their buck when it comes to MPS. So they just woke up. It's 8 a.m. They're going to get a morning workout in. When should they have that protein bolus to get the best response with exercise and protein, the synergy between the two?
Yeah, the literature would suggest it just matters in a 24-hour period, especially if you're young and healthy, that it doesn't really matter. I would say that there's evidence to support if you're older that, again, if you're older with anabolic resistance or increase in insulin resistance, then having protein closer to after you're done training is probably more ideal because of this synergistic effect. And again, most of the data, when you look at these studies, are done very closely after training. And potentially that's where the recommendation came from. But we know that works. So that component works. And that's where I would say if you are older or you have some kind of catabolic condition, it probably makes a little bit of a difference versus if you're young and healthy.
And when it comes to stimulus, there's such a wide range of resistance training from body weight exercises, low weight, high rep, high weight, low rep, and everything in between. What's the stimulus required resistance training wise for MPS?
Well, there's a really great paper, and it's loading recommendations for muscle strength, hypertrophy, and local endurance. Probably the best paper I've read in a very long time about this kind of concept and this continuation of what we recommend, right? There's lots of recommendations. I think what we're really looking for is a adaptation, right? So it's not the muscle protein synthetic response per se, but it's the adaptation that we are getting. Would you say that we would kind of agree with that?
Okay. So it's
right. So it's not the
specify a bit more on that.
Yeah. So what we're really looking for is it an increase in muscle strength? Is it an increase in muscle size? Is it an increase in endurance? We're really looking for some kind of physiological response.
Okay. Yes.
Right. So if we think about that we're looking for a physiological response, the way typically we think about exercise, or at least it's always been kind of outlined in the literature, is that there's a strength, hypertrophy, and an endurance kind of rep range continuum. But is it true that you have to lift really heavy to get some kind of muscle response? I would say they're different. For example, there's evidence to support that a individual who is older can put on muscle with lighter weights and much more repetition, right? Way outside of the hypertrophy zone of 8 to 12, And I think that it comes down to, number one, that we are looking for this adaptation. And number two, there are many ways to get the adaptation. So that's how I would explain kind of that piece of it.
And for somebody who is tuning in and say they're already a little bit later in life, 50 or beyond, you hear people talk about within the resistance training world, the fact that you need to start this early and you got to build up your reserve of muscle. And it almost sounds very, it sounds very discouraging for somebody who is going to begin this later in life. So what would you say to that person who's hasn't done this to this point, but they're 50 and beyond, they want to take this on? What can they really change at that point?
Oh, yeah. You see, there's literature of individuals, 80s and older, who put on muscle and improve strength. It's never too late.
And another piece of this too, especially when it comes to older people, is osteoporosis.
Yeah.
And what goes hand in hand with putting on muscle mass is you're going to put on bone density. So talk about the win-win there.
Yeah. This idea, so muscle mass and bone density, the pulling, and this is where the myokines come in, is there's also an interplay and crosstalk within, an interorgan crosstalk within the bone. I would say that one of the things that we can think about is that potentially loss of skeletal muscle mass could even be a predictor for osteopenia or osteoporosis because they are so interchangeable. In terms of, interchangeable is the wrong word, that they are so connected. In order to build healthy bone, you do need force, you do need resistance. And again, that contractile action supports bone. And for healthy bone, you need dietary protein.
As a physician, how many doctors out there do you think tell their patients as they're getting older the importance of resistance training when it comes to putting on bone? Because to me, it seems like the common thing prescribed is calcium and taking that supplement, having more passive
Yeah.
approach. So how do you feel about calcium? And then do you feel like like doctors are prescribing this resistance training? It's free. It's something anybody can begin at any age we've talked about.
They will more and more. I think in a geriatric population, they're going to more and more. I think that it will happen. I couldn't tell you the percentage of physicians that are talking about it, but I think more and more will be.
And coming back to the calcium piece, you mentioned the fact that
Yes,
protein's an important part of building bone, but are you a fan of taking calcium as a supplement?
I am, especially for women. Yeah, I am. Later on, when the hormonal milieu changes, yes, that is a current recommendation.
And the other supplement I think you talked about before was creatine. Any other supplements in this realm when it comes to putting on bone and
Yes,
muscle?
there's a new one. There's a new one
What's that?
called Urolithin A, Mitopure. Mitopure is a company.
Oh,
in Urolithin A.
you did talk about this one last time, but expand on it.
Did I
You
really?
did.
It's amazing. It's helps with mitophagy, which is the cleaning out of old mitochondria. But this company did it really right. They looked at the evidence and they generated over a decade of literature and really, really made sure that this stuff worked before they even brought it to market. So it helps with strength, it helps with endurance, it helps with energy, all because it helps with muscle health. I think it's going to be the frontier of the gut muscle access.
Let's talk more about gut health, as you mentioned, gut. It gets me thinking about the microbiome, and we've talked a lot about protein, and protein, when it comes to animal sources, isn't a source of fiber for the microbiome. But you've talked about the fact that you're not anti-plant, you're an omnivore.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about getting fiber through plants and the importance of that when it comes to maintaining a healthy microbiome?
I think it's important. I think that there's good evidence to support that the body needs fiber, and we need prebiotic, postbiotics. Gut health is huge. We do a lot of gut health in my clinic. So I have an active clinic. We still see patients. Fiber is really important, and again, these prebiotics, all critical.
You talk about the carnivore diet. We got to go there if you're talking about fiber. Sure. And you do have a little blurb in your book saying that this could be a useful tool, I believe short term in a certain case.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk about what that is?
Yeah, I have found that when individuals do, it's a carnivore reset, which is it's like a full elimination diet that, again, it's just a great reset. And we've used it in clinic. I don't recommend, again, it's so individual for people. If you want to, it's totally up to them, whatever they want to do. But in clinical practice, for me, we use a carnivore reset if someone is having really bad GI issues, and it seems to be very helpful over time.
And any reason you're not a proponent of that long term? Is it the microbiome piece?
Well, I mean, I think that there are some people that will do fine on it long term. It just depends on the microbiome. I really think that it is so individualistic. It is so individual.
Let's talk about biggest mistakes you see when people are going about resistance training and it's new to them. They're taking this on.
The biggest thing is not working hard enough and not really having this mind-muscle connection and really being focused and thinking about what they're doing and quitting too early. The first adaptations are usually somewhat neuromuscular before you see gains in strength or size. So don't let the quit in. As my friend Lisa Jaster says, don't let the quit in.
We'll talk more about the timeline piece. How long does it take before we start to see all the different physiological changes when somebody is new to this?
It depends on the person. Well, someone who is doing resistance training or endurance type exercises, you'll see an improvement in insulin sensitivity and skeletal muscle almost immediately. You'll see a short-term improvement in HDL and triglycerides and LDL. But again, you have to do these things consistently, but that's pretty immediate. It's not maintained. You have to continue to train. From a size perspective, when you're first starting a program, again, there's this kind of neuromuscular adaptation. But once you begin to put on tissue, there's so many, it's very complex as to who does it. Are they a hard gainer or really good? Again, there's total genetic variability, but if someone's young, they could definitely put on 1 pound to 2 pounds of muscle in a month, especially if they're untrained. Again, it really just depends. But the first adaptations are neuromuscular.
And how do you feel about cardio in this whole piece?
I think it's great.
Specifically
not
to MPS, is there any relationship between the two? And then in general?
No. Yeah. I think that when I think about cardiovascular activity, I think about mitochondrial health. I think about, volume. I think about volume and its effect on mitochondrial content. But I don't think about it as it relates to hypertrophy, but it is good for cardiovascular activity and heart health and blood flow.
And this ties into something I really like from the book, the fact that you like to allocate carbs depending on activity level. And this isn't totally directed at cardio, but I really like this way of thinking about it. For somebody that's going to include, say, 60 more grams of carbs in a day, time that with a day when you're going to be training and look at that as fuel for that workout.
I think that's a great strategy. Because, the last thing you want to do is eat a huge carbohydrate meal and it not be for any purpose. Like, what's the metabolic purpose except to kind of stress out your insulin? I just don't think it's ideal. You have to be training. You have to earn your carbs.
And when it comes to the training piece and the dietary piece, how do you look at that when it comes to men versus women?
I don't. I've been looking at the literature a lot. I think we still need more work to be done. Obviously, there are clearly differences, and we are going to see literature come out. But as of right now, I haven't seen the literature yet. But I know it's coming out because I know my friends are doing it. They just haven't published some of the data, and I think that you're going to see that there's a difference in protein amounts. But as of right now, again, I would say not. And then training. I think there's a lot of discussion on female training syncing with their cycle. I can't say that that's effective, at least from what I've seen. But I don't train professional athletes. I don't know the input or influence that would have on an everyday person.
Throughout our conversation, we've given a lot of detail, a lot of nuance for people that really want to get into the weeds with this. But for the average person who is, busy right now, they have a family, they have kids, and they have a job, and they want to get the maximum benefit for putting in the minimum dose or a lower dose of what we talked about. So what I'm getting at here is, how do they get the biggest bang for their buck when it comes to resistance training and dietary protein with everything we've talked about?
Well, first of all, they have to read my book because I make it very, very, very simple and straightforward. And there's evidence to support you could easily train 2 days a week and still get benefit. I mean, that is the minimum effective dose, 2 days a week of resistance training. You might throw in some short intervals in there, but it doesn't take much to stimulate muscle and to maintain muscle health. It actually doesn't take much. And dietary protein, again, to create a diet is not difficult. It's just requires consistency from a very high level. Figure out how much protein you need, dose it appropriately. Don't go crazy. It doesn't have to be 1 gram per pound ideal body weight. It can be less, but just definitely nail that low-hanging fruit.
And for somebody who doesn't have any weights at home and they're going to take this on starting today and want to use body weight and just start with a very simple program, can you give them 3 to 5 exercises they can do to get started?
I actually I did an entire exercise library.
Did
you know that?
No,
Did you see it?
Where can we find that?
My website.
Okay, well, we'll link that up, but can you take us through a bit of what that looks like?
Squats are a great exercise. Squats. So I do this all the time. We do squats, we do push-ups and lunges. Those would be my top 3. Walking lunges. So squats, walking lunges, and push-ups.
And how do you feel about walking as a form of cardio to add into that mix?
I think walking should be a part of your life. I think we should really kind of up the ante.
So do you have a certain amount of steps per day you like to aim for? Walking after meals to help regulate blood glucose?
I do.
How do you
I do.
incorporate that?
I walk 10,000 steps a day. I probably should walk double that. I think it's a little bit of an arbitrary number. Definitely walking after a meal, I think is great. It's a great way to leverage skeletal muscle to lower blood sugar, quite simply. But you cannot, it's not exercise or resistance training. Resistance training is your non-negotiable.
Talk more about that, because
It's just you're
oftentimes
non-negotiable.
people within their health and wellness routine, I feel like they don't consider that as a non-negotiable, and how the mindset piece of putting that in as something you're gonna do is so essential.
You're never going to feel, let me say this, that capacity is cultivated, and it's not cultivated through comfort. The mindset piece is the most important piece, because I can give you the perfect program, but unless you feel worthy of obtaining it, unless you feel that you have the tools to become that kind of person, you will always sabotage yourself.
Well, let's talk about what doing that work is, because you do make it very apparent when you read your book. You have a mindset piece at the end of each chapter, and you say that the mind is the most important muscle to work on. So for somebody to kick off, to make sure they can fully embrace everything we're saying today, how do they incorporate that mindset piece to get that rolling?
Yeah. The first thing I would do is, I mean, there's a series of things, which is why I put a whole bunch in my book. The first step, I would say, well, there's many first steps, so you can pick which one you're going to do, but really think about who the person is that you want to become, and do the actions match with what you are doing. So who do you want to become? And if you want to become someone strong and fit, then take those actions. And that would be the first thing. So everything has to answer to an action. The next thing I would think is, do you feel worthy? What's your worthiness temperature? I see a lot of people are influenced by old trauma that really crushes their capacity. And so instead of really working towards their health and wellness, they're running from an old trauma that's been unidentified. And if you do not identify and face the old traumas, you will constantly be running from them. And I know that might seem separate from health and wellness, but it sure, again, I've been a practicing physician for over a decade. It's not separate. It's just not. You have to do the work. You have to figure it out. And oftentimes, there doesn't have to be a narrative around it. It just has to be addressed. It doesn't have to have a huge narrative. And then the other thing I would say is really identifying your weaknesses. People right now always focus on strengths. Your strengths don't matter. You're not falling short of becoming the person you want to become because of your strengths. You're falling short because of your weaknesses. And you have to know your weaknesses, because then you can plan for them. You can't account for things that you aren't aware of. And then the human dynamic is amazing, because then it's shocked every time. Shocked when you don't get the results, and shocked because they're reaching for another cookie when you know that every time you're stressed, you reach for a cookie. So you plan for that.
Gabrielle, up until this point, we've talked a lot about what to do when it comes to resistance training, having enough protein, dietary changes, getting the mindset right. I want to flip things now and talk about things from a recovery standpoint. So let's start talking about the importance of sleep, and then other modalities we can use for recovery.
Yeah, so sleep, one night of sleep restriction can decrease muscle protein synthetic response by 18%. Sleep is really important. I don't get enough of it, so I can't tell people to do something that I don't do, but I'm trying. Sleep is very important. It's also the time that the brain cleans itself, the glial cells get rid of metabolic waste. It's really important. And I think that people always talk about it. It's also important from a metabolism point of view. helps with blood sugar regulation, helps with insulin response. Again, untreated sleep apnea is a risk factor for what I believe as obesity. And you got to get into sleep. From a recovery aspect, the other things are, you choose it. You could choose whether it's massage, whether it's an ice bath, whether it's sauna, whatever it is that you like, you choose.
And how do you look at recovery specifically from resistance training? Somebody that's gone into the gym, they've pushed it, they're feeling a little bit sore in a good way. How do they know how long to take in between workouts and give their body that rest they need to rebuild and repair?
Yeah, I think most people are not training hard enough that it becomes a major issue. But again, listening to your body is really helpful. And it's listening to your body, but also sticking to a plan. For example, I've been traveling a lot with this book. I was exhausted today. I still got up at 4, got myself up, hung out with my husband, got my kids. I took my kids to the gym. I trained at 7. And I walked in, I'm like, oh God, I work with a trainer. I work out of a place called Sigma here in Houston. Shout out to Carlos. And I was like, Carlos, I don't want to work that hard. He's like, yeah, right. We're doing it. And I worked hard, but I worked safe and I felt great. But I could have easily talked myself out of it. Oh, I need another recovery day. No, I need to be training. And also intensive training can offset lack of sleep. But yes, recovery is important. Yes, you should listen to your body, but you should also have a program that you stick to. I don't know. People do all this other stuff like heart rate variability. I don't look at that stuff. I think it's important to limit a little technology. The best hack is hard work, my friend, not less work.
One thing I want to highlight there, the fact that you are somebody who's a scientist in this area, understands the physiology of muscle and diet, and you still have a trainer that you work with. So talk about why that is. Is that just for the motivation on days when you're going to skip the gym, or what is it that you get from that as somebody who does understand all these nuances?
Yeah, I'm not my own doctor either. Yeah, I got to outsource that. No, definitely not. I'm also not a fitness professional.
But you know the ins and outs. I mean, you know what you need to do in the gym, and you know what you need to do for recovery and to fuel your body properly. But yet you're still paying for that and subscribing to that service. And that the reason I want to highlight that is because, again, if you're somebody who's doing that, there must be a lot of value in that.
Yep, there is. I always work with a trainer, always work with a coach.
The last thing I want to end on here is kids. And at what age, we talked about from a dietary piece, how because of the hormones, the MPS isn't important when kids are really young, and it becomes more important around 30. But from a training perspective, as somebody with young kids, at what age can you start to have them do resistance training?
Right now, my 2-year-old does it.
Okay. And at what age did your 2-year-old start?
Just recently. They just get interested. Yeah.
And is that just to form the habit, or is there certain benefits that a 2-year-old's going to get from doing that?
I mean, I haven't seen 2-year-olds studied, but there is the skeletal muscle cells that you have, the time to really prime them is when they're young. The health of this tissue is really important. Movement and capacity is really important. And they get into the habit. I mean, can you imagine? I have a few different businesses. I run a practice. I have 2 very little children and a husband who works as a surgical resident, right? And I am still bringing my children to the gym. They should still be exposed to that stuff. We are upstairs, we do push-ups. I only see the upside of this.
It's interesting because I feel like classically, the way it's been portrayed and passed down is that kids up until at least their teens, and maybe even arguably beyond that, should be not involving themselves in resistance training. And there could be some damage done to the body if they get into it too early.
Yeah. That's all fake. How about that? It's fake. I mean, it's not like my kid is doing deadlifts, but if you look at my Instagram stories, I mean, my kids are working out and they're strong. They're strong and they're capable and they should be doing it. And it should be fun for them. And in my book, I think I put some of, I mean, I know I put, I don't know if it's the American Pediatric Society, but talked about the recommendations. Get your kids training young, get them strong. And it's never too late. It's never too late.
Gabrielle, I think what's going to bring a lot of people to this conversation is going to be the weight loss piece. That's what brings a lot of people, I'm sure, to a lot of my conversations, because that's such a ongoing challenge for a lot of people in the modern world. So as we wrap up here, we've talked about the MPS and getting the protein. That's definitely a big piece of this. Resistance training. What other pieces, the recovery, but what other pieces can we add to that for somebody who right now is struggling to lose weight? And coming back to how we opened up, somebody that's tried different diets and playing with macros and they're just not getting it. And they feel like they've really even tried some of the stuff we're talking about today. What's some other nuance and different things they can add into what I just said?
So you're not going to like this answer. Oh, well, I'm putting words into your mouth. But the treatment should match the severity of the challenge. So if an individual has tried everything and is really suffering, then that may be the time to implement medication to whether it's improve metabolism or improve insulin sensitivity. I am not one of those physicians who does not believe in using pharmaceuticals when necessary. So if you have done everything right and you are still not moving the needle and are unhappy and it is affecting your mental health and your family and the way that you show up in the world, then that is when you would consider moving to something stronger. And there's no shame in that.
Okay, fair enough. But do you feel like there are people genetically or due to certain health complications that just can't put the pieces together like we talked about and get there naturally? Is this what I'm getting at here? Is this a substitute for what we're talking about, or are there really people out there who do everything we're saying and just can't get to their goal weight?
I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but again, I've been a physician in practice for a very long time. And sometimes people do everything right, and whether they have other challenges in their life that for some reason it's not working, I have seen it have a tremendous impact, and then you take them off the medication and they're able to maintain it. So I think we have to be open-minded about things and use the modalities and the tools that we have.
Now that you're done with Gabrielle, you're going to want to stick around here and catch my chat with Sal. He'll teach you how to burn fat and build muscle. You don't want to miss this. I'll see you over there.
You know, there's this belief that workouts need to be grueling, grinding, painful, crazy.